She had saved lives in war zones where helicopters couldn't land and radios went silent. She had carried wounded soldiers through darkness with nothing but her hands and whatever supplies she could find. She had done things that never made it into any report, in places that don't appear on any map. And now she was standing in a hospital hallway in Denton, Oregon, being told by a man with soft hands and an expensive watch that she didn't belong in rooms where real decisions were made. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the convoy pulling into the parking lot had come specifically for her. Before we go any further, if you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because stories like this one drop on this channel every week, and you do not want to miss what comes next. While you're at it, smash the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The morning shift at Callaway Regional Medical Center started the same way it always did, with too many patients, not enough staff, and a charge nurse somewhere in the back already counting down the hours until handoff. Denton, Oregon was not a large city. It sat in the kind of valley that collected fog in the mornings and kept it until noon, surrounded by timber country and old highway routes that most people only passed through on their way somewhere else. Callaway Regional was the only full-service hospital within 60 miles in any direction, which meant it saw everything: farming accidents, logging injuries, overdoses, car wrecks, chest pains, and the slow grinding illnesses that came from decades of hard physical work and not enough money to deal with them early. The emergency department operated on barely enough. The waiting room chairs were bolted to the floor, and 3 of them had torn armrests held together with electrical tape. The fluorescent lighting above Bay 4 flickered whenever the HVAC system cycled on. Nobody had gotten around to fixing it. Nurse Diane Ashford moved through the department the way water moves around rocks, without conflict, without announcement, finding the path that needed her. She was 41 years old with dark hair she kept pulled back tight, a voice that never climbed above a measured calm, and hands that worked faster than most people in that building thought about anything. She had been at Callaway Regional for 3 years. Before that, nobody asked, and she never offered. The department called her Diane. They didn't call her much else. She wasn't unfriendly. She remembered birthdays, brought coffee to night shift handoffs, and never once let a patient feel like an inconvenience, even when the department was running at capacity and every bay was occupied and the triage line stretched into the waiting room. But she kept a distance that wasn't cold. It was just present, like a boundary that existed without needing a sign. Most of the staff had stopped wondering about her past after the first year. You worked alongside someone long enough. You started filling in the gaps with whatever felt comfortable. Diane was experienced. Diane was competent. Diane was the nurse you wanted in Bay 2 when things got bad. That was enough for most of them. It wasn't enough for Dr. Raymond Greer. Greer had been medical director of emergency services at Callaway Regional for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had developed a very specific map of the world. On that map, there were people who mattered and people who supported the people who mattered. Physicians were the former, nurses were the latter. The line between them was not something he considered debatable, so it was structural, biological almost, the natural order of a functioning medical hierarchy. He was not cruel in any obvious way. He didn't shout. He didn't throw things. His particular brand of condescension was quieter than that. It lived in the way he talked past people, in the way he explained things to nurses, the way you'd explain things to a student who needed remediation, in the way he accepted praise in rooms where other people had done most of the work. He was 53. He had a framed photograph of himself shaking hands with the state health commissioner on the wall of his office. He kept his coat pressed and his badge visible at all times. He had never once, in 11 years, asked Diane Ashford a direct question about her clinical judgment. That morning, the department was running at about 70% capacity by 7:15. Diane took report from the outgoing night nurse, Terry, who looked exhausted in the specific way that only 12-hour nights produced, and walked the department once before touching a single chart. She did this every shift. She would move through the bays without stopping, without looking at paperwork, just looking at people. The residents thought it was a habit. The attending physicians didn't notice it at all. The nurses who had worked with her long enough had stopped questioning it. In Bay 6, an elderly man named Harold Prentice was sitting upright against the bed rail at an angle that was almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. His admitting complaint was lower back pain. He had been there since 3 in the morning. His color was not right. Diane stopped at the door. She looked at him for 4 seconds, not at his chart, not at the monitor, at him. And then she stepped inside. Mr. Prentice, her voice was level. Can you tell me if you're feeling any pressure anywhere? Not pain necessarily, pressure. Harold Prentice was 77 and had the kind of face that came from a lifetime of outdoor work, deeply lined and weathered around the eyes. He looked at her with the particular wariness of someone who'd been in a hospital waiting room for hours and had stopped expecting useful conversation. Some, he said. Chest. Figured it was just the position. How long? Maybe an hour, maybe more. I didn't want to bother anyone. Diane was already at the monitor. She made 2 adjustments, rechecked his oxygen saturation, and stepped to the door. I need a 12 lead in base 6 right now, she said to the tech passing in the hall. Not loudly, not urgently, in the same tone someone might use to ask for a pen. The tech looked up. Dr. Greer hasn't... I know. Pull it. The tech pulled it. 4 minutes later, Diane was looking at a strip that told a very specific story, and she went directly to find Dr. Greer, who was at the nurses' station reviewing charts with 2 second-year residents, explaining something about documentation standards in a tone that suggested the conversation had been going on longer than necessary. Mr. Prentice in Bay 6, Diane said, I need you to look at his EKG. Greer didn't look up from the chart. Prentice is a back pain admit. Night team already worked him up. His EKG is showing changes. I want you to see it. Now he looked up. The expression on his face was the expression of a man being interrupted in the middle of something important by something he had already decided was not important. Nurse Ashford. He said her name the way people say a word they're mildly tired of. If you have a clinical concern, document it in the chart and flag it for the resident. That is the correct process. The correct process takes 20 minutes. I'd like you to look at the strip now. One of the residents, a third-year named Kowalski, who had worked with Diane long enough to know that she did not chase down attendings for minor things, shifted slightly in his chair. Greer set down the chart. He looked at Diane with the specific patience of someone who has decided to demonstrate composure rather than feel it. You are a nurse, he said. You triage, you monitor, you administer medications under physician order. You do not interrupt attending physician conferences to deliver cardiology opinions. The hallway wasn't exactly silent, but it got quieter. Diane held his gaze. He's been symptomatic for over an hour. His pressure's up in the left arm and down in the right. Greer's expression didn't change. Document your observations and flag for resident review. He picked up the chart again. Diane stood there for exactly 1 second, then turned and walked back to Bay 6. She said nothing inflammatory. She did not argue. She pulled up a chair next to Harold Prentice's bed, rechecked his vitals herself, and asked him 3 more questions in the same quiet voice while the monitor continued printing data she was very carefully logging. Kowalski appeared in the doorway 4 minutes later. He looked at the strip she held out without her saying a word. His face changed. I'll get Greer, he said. Get cardiology, Diane said. Now. She was right. The attending cardiologist confirmed it within the hour. A dissection, early stage, the kind that looked like nothing on a basic assessment and killed people in back pain rooms because nobody looked closely enough. Harold Prentice was transferred to interventional cardiology within 40 minutes of Diane's initial flag. Dr. Greer spent the rest of the morning pretending the whole sequence of events had unfolded according to normal protocol. Nobody on the floor said anything directly. But Kowalski caught Diane's eye in the hall and gave her a short nod that meant something more than courtesy. She nodded back and moved on to the next patient. By 10 o'clock, she had covered 4 additional patients, assisted a difficult IV placement on a pediatric case that 2 other nurses had already attempted, and quietly reorganized the supply cart in Bay 3 that had been stocked in the wrong order for the past week without saying anything to anyone about it. The department moved differently when Diane was on shift. Veteran nurses knew it and couldn't quite explain it. Things got caught earlier. Bottlenecks cleared. Patients who were starting to spiral got attention before the spiral became a crisis. She was not loud about any of it. That was the part that frustrated people like Raymond Greer more than anything else, though he would never have admitted that. You couldn't criticize excellence when it came quietly. You couldn't diminish someone who never asked for recognition. All you could do was enforce hierarchy and hope the hierarchy held. He called her into his office at 10:45. She sat across from his desk, the desk with the framed health commissioner photograph, the small potted plant that was slowly dying because his office got no real light, the stack of journals he displayed more than he read. And she waited. "I want to address this morning," Greer said. "All right. You circumvented established clinical workflow. I flagged a critical finding. You interrupted an attending conference to deliver a nursing opinion about a cardiology case." He folded his hands. "That is not appropriate clinical behavior, regardless of outcome." Diane looked at him steadily. "Mr. Prentice is alive." "That is not the point I'm making." "I understand the point you're making." Something about the way she said it. Not defensively, not sarcastically, just with a flatness that suggested she had sat across from people like him before, and would sit across from people like him again, seemed to bother him more than a direct argument would have. "You've been here 3 years," Greer said. "You have consistent performance reviews. You are technically competent, but competence does not override process." He paused. "And frankly, your manner with senior staff has been noted on more than one occasion." "My manner?" "You don't defer. It's noticed." Diane looked at the dying plant on his windowsill for a half-second, then back at him. "Dr. Greer, with respect, deference is not the same as competence. I'm here for the patients." "You're here as part of a team," he said, "a team with a structure. And when that structure is ignored, it breaks down for everyone, not just the person ignoring it." She didn't argue. She didn't agree either. She simply said, "Is there anything else?" He hadn't expected that. He'd expected pushback or apology, or some version of emotion that he could manage. The absence of both made him shift in his chair. "I'm placing a note in your file," he said, "regarding professional communication." "Understood." She stood. She left. In the hallway, she passed Dr. Sandra Tully, the hospitalist attending who had started at Callaway about 6 months ago and had already formed the opinion that Raymond Greer was the specific type of obstacle that well-organized medical systems tried to build around rather than through. Sandra watched Diane walk back toward the department with the unhurried, straight-backed walk of someone who had just been told something unpleasant and had already filed it in the appropriate place. "Everything all right?" Sandra asked quietly. "Fine," Diane said. Sandra glanced toward Greer's office. Harold Prentice's daughter called from the ICU waiting room. She wanted to know the name of the nurse who caught it. Diane didn't stop walking. "Tell her I hope he does well." Sandra watched her go. There was something in the way Diane moved, not performance, not posture for effect, that Sandra had noticed since the woman's first week. She'd tried to place it for months. It wasn't nursing school confidence or the comfortable ease of long tenure. It was something older than that, something trained in a specific way. Sandra had been a military brat, moved 6 times before she was 18, spent enough time on military bases to recognize a certain kind of person. The ones who came back from somewhere and didn't talk about it. The ones who were never startled, never caught off guard, who scanned every room as a matter of reflex rather than intention. She'd wondered before. She went back to her charts. The afternoon shifts started coming in around 2 o'clock. And the department had the brief, strange calmness of the early afternoon lull between the lunch hour rush and the post-school and work wave that usually started around 4. Diane was charting at the nurse's station when the double doors from the ambulance bay opened and a man in a wheelchair was pushed through. He was in his 60s, heavy-set, with the particular pale and sweating quality that meant his body was using everything it had on something internal. His name, according to the paramedic running at his side, was Marcus Webb. Former Army. Came in from the VA-affiliated clinic across town that didn't have the equipment to handle what they were seeing. Diane was already on her feet. The admitting resident, a second-year named Flores, was moving toward the bay at the same time, reading the paramedic's report over his own shoulder while walking. Abdominal pain onset 4 hours ago, progressively worsening. BP's been fluctuating, the paramedic said. "I see it," Flores said. "Let's get him to Bay 7. Diane took one look at Marcus Webb's face and moved to his left side before anyone told her to. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were alert despite the pain, the kind of alert that came from discipline, not comfort. "You're all right," she said, not reassuringly, just directly. "We've got you." Something shifted in his expression, like he'd heard something in her voice that registered on a frequency other people didn't pick up. "How bad?" he asked. "We're going to find out." She helped transfer him to the bay bed. As she adjusted the positioning, she noted the way he compensated. Left side, subtle guarding, rigid where it should have given way. She noted the sweat pattern. She noted that his right hand, gripping the bed rail, had the kind of knuckle structure that came from years of heavy physical work, and this was where her attention sharpened: impact training. She started his IV while Flores ordered imaging. Marcus Webb looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "You move like someone who's worked in the field," he said. "Emergency department," she said. "No." He held her gaze. "Like field. Outside, not hospital." Diane placed the IV with the clean efficiency of someone who had started lines in conditions that made this look easy. She capped it, labeled it, turned to document. "I'm going to need to check your pressure in both arms," she said. "I know what that means," he said quietly. "Do you?" "Yeah." A pause. "I've seen it before, in people who were trying not to let on that they were looking for something." She looked at him. He had the kind of eyes that had been trained to assess people and knew it was happening when someone else was doing it. "How long have you been out?" she asked. He blinked. Not a tell, just a recalibration. "What makes you think I was in?" She didn't answer that. She checked his right arm pressure, then his left, wrote down the numbers and said, "Dr. Flores is going to want a CT. I'll make sure it's expedited." Marcus Webb watched her leave the bay. Then he looked at the inside of his left wrist, at a small tattoo there, a marking from a unit that no longer officially existed, the kind of designation that only appeared in records that required specific clearance to access. His jaw tightened. He reached for the call button, then stopped. He needed to think. The problem with Callaway Regional, as Diane had understood from her first week, was that the organizational dysfunction wasn't random. It was structured. It came from the top in the specific shape of Raymond Greer's priorities, which were, in order, institutional reputation, physician hierarchy, and then, somewhere down the list, patient outcomes. Not because he didn't care about patients, but because he had conflated the first two with the third so completely that he could no longer see where one ended and the others began. The consequence of this was a department that ran on anxiety. Junior staff overcharted because they were terrified of being questioned. Residents ordered redundant tests because they'd learned that uncertain judgment cost more than certain overtesting. Good instincts got processed through 3 layers of consultation before anyone acted on them. Diane had spent 3 years working around this without directly confronting it, because confronting it was not why she was here. She was here because Denton was small and unremarkable, and 45 minutes from the kind of emptiness that a person could disappear into if they needed to, and because Callaway Regional needed nurses badly enough that they didn't ask many questions during the hiring process, and because she had spent enough years being somewhere loud and significant that quiet and unremarkable felt, for a while, like something close to rest. It wasn't peace. She wasn't sure she had the hardware for peace anymore, but it was manageable. It was contained. At 3:15, Dr. Greer appeared in the department with a woman Diane hadn't seen before. Administrator, by the look of her, pressed blazer, no stethoscope, carrying the particular expression of someone who moved through healthcare facilities in a supervisory capacity. Her name, Diane heard in passing, was Bernadette Cole. She was from the Regional Hospital Network's central office in Portland. Cole was doing some kind of operational review. Greer was escorting her with the slightly too attentive manner of a man who wanted to make sure the right version of the department was presented. At 3:45, Cole stopped at the nurses' station while Greer went to take a call. She looked at the department with the focused assessment of someone who had done this many times. Then she looked at Diane. "You've been here 3 years?" Cole asked. "Yes." "Before that?" Diane met the question with the specific neutrality she had developed for exactly this kind of inquiry. "Various positions." Cole studied her for a moment. "You have an unusual baseline calm for an emergency department nurse." "It's a useful quality." "It is." Cole glanced at the board, then back. "I've seen 3 critical interventions flagged on your shift in the last month, all of which—" "Diane." It was Flores appearing from the direction of radiology. His expression had changed. "Can you come look at Webb's CT?" She excused herself. The CT told a story that required immediate action. She was back at the imaging screen for 45 seconds before she went directly to find the attending surgeon on call, bypassing Flores not to undercut him, but because the clock on the situation had just shortened significantly. The attending surgeon, Dr. Lila Park, who was direct and did not require the same management that Greer did, looked at the images and said, "Or now." Marcus Webb was prepped within 20 minutes. Diane did not go with him to the OR. Her job was the department. But as the gurney moved past her toward the elevator, Marcus Webb turned his head and looked at her. "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. "Get rest," she said. He looked at her for another second. Then the elevator doors closed. Diane went back to the station and picked up the next chart. Behind her, unseen, in the corridor near the department's east entrance, a man she had not noticed, 50s, short gray hair, wearing civilian clothes that hung on him with a particular fit that suggested someone who spent most of his life in uniform, had been watching the department for the past 7 minutes. He watched Diane move through the bay assignments with the smooth, unhurried efficiency of someone who had done more difficult things in worse conditions and knew it. He made a phone call. He spoke for less than 30 seconds. Then he said 4 words. "I think it's her." He closed the phone. He did not leave the corridor. At 4:07, Diane was adjusting an IV line in Bay 3 when the charge nurse, a veteran named Pauline, who had worked at Callaway for 16 years, appeared in the doorway with an expression that Diane cataloged immediately. Not alarm, something different, uncertain. "There are 2 men at the entrance," Pauline said quietly. "They asked for the nursing supervisor. They're—" She paused. "They're in uniform, Diane, not security, military." Diane did not react. She finished adjusting the IV line. She checked the drip rate. She capped the port. "Which branch?" she asked. Pauline blinked. "I don't— Army, I think. There's insignia. I didn't— Thank you, Pauline." She stepped out of the bay. Down the corridor at the main entrance to the department, 2 men in Army service uniforms stood speaking quietly with the charge desk coordinator, who looked mildly alarmed at the departure from normal admissions procedure. One of the men, a colonel, Diane assessed at distance without breaking stride, was holding a folder. The other one she recognized. Not by name, by posture, by the way he stood in a room like he'd calculated every exit before he walked in. She had trained people to stand that way. She stopped walking. The colonel looked up and saw her. He said something to the man next to him. Both of them started toward her. Behind her, Raymond Greer appeared from his office, drawn by the disruption to the usual flow of his department. He saw the uniforms. He straightened his coat and moved toward the men with the practiced confidence of someone who was accustomed to being the most senior person in any room. "Gentlemen," he said, extending his hand to the colonel. "Dr. Raymond Greer, medical director. Can I help you?" The colonel shook his hand briefly without breaking his line of movement toward Diane. "We're here for one of your staff," the colonel said. Greer blinked. "I'm sorry?" "We need a few minutes with Nurse Ashford." Greer looked from the colonel to Diane, and the expression on his face did something complicated. Confusion mixed with the specific discomfort of a man whose hierarchy was being rearranged in front of his department staff. "She's on shift," he said. "Whatever this is, it can wait until—" "It can't," the colonel said. Not unkindly, flatly, in the tone of someone who had delivered similar information in more difficult rooms. Greer looked at Diane. Diane looked at the colonel. "Give me 2 minutes," she said. Not to Greer. To the colonel. He nodded. She went to Pauline, handed off her current patients in 60 seconds with the specificity of a person who had handed off patients in high-stakes environments and knew exactly what information mattered and what didn't. Pauline took the handoff without questions because Pauline had worked with Diane long enough to know that questions right now would not be useful. Then Diane walked to the consultation room off the main corridor, and the 2 men followed her in, and the door closed. Raymond Greer stood in the middle of his emergency department, slightly outside the normal flow of activity, watching the closed door. For the first time in 11 years, he had no idea what was happening inside his own building. Pauline appeared at his elbow. "Should we—" "Give them the room," Greer said. But his voice had lost something. In the consultation room, one of the men placed a document on the table. Diane looked at it. She had not seen certain letterheads in 3 years. "How did you find this location?" she asked. We've been looking for 8 months, the colonel said. We weren't the only ones. She looked up from the document. The second man, the one she'd recognized by posture, met her eyes. There's a situation, he said, and you're the only person cleared for it. Down the hall, Marcus Webb's surgical team had opened and found exactly what Diane's assessment had predicted. Nothing more and nothing less. And somewhere in the parking lot of Callaway Regional Medical Center, a black SUV was pulling in that had not been there an hour ago. The driver stayed in the vehicle. He was waiting for a confirmation call, the call that would tell him whether the woman in that consultation room was who they thought she was, and whether she would agree to come back. The call never came. The driver in the black SUV sat with the engine running for 11 minutes before he got out, checked his phone once, and leaned against the hood with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting without being told how long. He had been in this business long enough to know that silence from the consultation room was not a bad sign. It meant the conversation was going deeper than a simple confirmation. It meant the woman inside was asking questions, which meant she was still capable of asking them, which meant the 8 months of searching had not been wasted. Inside the consultation room, Diane Ashford had not touched the document on the table. She was looking at Colonel Dennis Farrow, the one she'd assessed by rank when he walked in, and at the other man, whose name she already knew from his face and hadn't said out loud yet, partly out of caution and partly because saying it out loud made it real in a way she wasn't ready to commit to. How many people know this location? She asked again. Within our chain, Farrow said. 4, including the 2 of us. Outside. A pause that told her more than the answer would. That's part of the problem, the second man said. His name was Garrett Odom. He had been a warrant officer in a unit that had worked alongside Diane's for 14 months, in a theater of operations she had agreed never to name in civilian company. He was 46 now, and his hair had gone fully gray in a way that suggested the last several years had not been administrative. Someone else is looking, Diane said. Someone else found a thread, Odom said. We don't know how far they pulled it. She absorbed that. On the table between them, the document with the letterhead she hadn't seen in 3 years sat face up in the fluorescent light of a consultation room that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. And it was asking her, in bureaucratic language that managed to be both precise and deliberately vague, to agree to a briefing at a location she would not be told until she signed the first page. I'm not signing anything tonight, she said. We're not asking you to, Farrow said. Then what are you asking? Odom leaned forward, forearms on the table. We're asking you to hear the situation. Full briefing, no commitment. If you walk away after, we walk away. And the thread someone else pulled? We contain it. That's already in motion. She looked at him. You don't contain threads like that. You cut them or they unravel. We know. So what you're actually telling me is that there's a timeline. Neither of them answered immediately, which was the answer. Diane looked at the document one more time. She did not pick it up. Give me until end of shift, she said. I have patients to hand off properly. Farrow nodded. We'll be outside. She stood. Odom stood. For a moment they were both on the same side of the table, and she could see up close what 3 years had done to him. The tightness around his eyes, the way he carried tension in his left shoulder from an injury she knew about, because she'd been the one who assessed it in a building in a country she was not going to think about right now. Now you look tired, she said. I've been looking for you for 8 months, he said. She went back to the department. The door opened and Raymond Greer was standing approximately 12 feet away with the studied nonchalance of a man who had been standing approximately 12 feet away for the past 20 minutes. Everything resolved? He asked. Yes. If there's something I should be aware of as medical director. It's a personal matter, Diane said, and moved past him to the nurse's station. Greer watched her go. He had been constructing a version of events since the moment the uniformed men walked into his department, and none of the versions he'd assembled quite fit together. Diane Ashford did not have the profile of someone who had military entanglements. She had the profile of someone who had deliberately built a life with no profile at all, which was, he was beginning to understand in some inarticulate way, a profile of its own. He went back to his office. At his desk, he opened her personnel file, not for the first time, but with more focus than he'd given it before. Employment history prior to Callaway was listed as a series of short tenure positions at facilities in Montana, Wyoming, and one in Washington state. References were provided and had been checked at higher, returning clean. Education was documented. Certifications were current. Nothing in the file was irregular, which was, now that he was paying attention, itself slightly irregular. Most nurses who'd been working 15 years had a file that accumulated texture, commendations, complaints. The small sediment of a professional life lived visibly. Diane's file was functional and oddly smooth, like it had been assembled to cover the necessary ground and nothing more. He closed the file. He told himself it was none of his business. He was not entirely successful. The afternoon continued to move, the way hospital afternoons moved, in irregular rhythms of urgency and waiting, with the waiting often harder on people than the urgency. Diane worked her remaining hours the same way she always worked them, which meant completely, without visible distraction, without any indication to the patients in her care that she was carrying anything besides the immediate task in front of her. She checked on an 8-year-old named Cody, who had come in with a forearm fracture from a bicycle fall, and was now in the process of deciding whether the cast color options presented to him were adequately serious for a person of his stature. She got a blood pressure on a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher named Ruth Ellison, who had come in with dizziness and was now chatting amiably about her azaleas. She helped a young man named Torres, early 20s, construction work, a nail gun injury that looked dramatic, and was, mercifully, less serious than it appeared, stay calm through a procedure he was handling with somewhat less composure than he wanted anyone to notice. "Deep breath," she said. "Look at the ceiling." "I'm fine," Torres said, not looking fine. "I know. Deep breath anyway." He breathed. His color improved. She was good at this in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with having been, at various points in her career, the person standing next to someone who was genuinely not going to be fine, and having learned through that experience exactly how much difference a calm voice made and exactly how little the words themselves mattered. At 5:40, Pauline appeared beside her at the station. "The men in uniform are still outside," Pauline said quietly. "The parking lot. There's an SUV." "I know." "Diane." Pauline's voice dropped another register. "Is everything all right?" Pauline had been at Callaway for 16 years. She had seen nurses go through divorces, custody battles, financial collapses, sick parents, all of it, and she had the particular warmth of someone who had accumulated enough human difficulty to take it seriously without dramatizing it. Diane looked at her. "I'm okay, Pauline." "That didn't answer my question." A beat. "No, it didn't." Pauline waited. "I'll know more after tonight," Diane said. "I'll be in tomorrow." Pauline nodded slowly. She wasn't satisfied with this, but she recognized that pressing wasn't going to open anything, and she had enough respect for Diane to leave it where it was. At 6:10, Diane did her final patient handoff to the incoming shift nurse. A thorough, methodical transfer that covered every active case, every pending result, every small flag that the night team would need. She was not cutting corners because she was distracted. She was finishing the job the way she always finished every job, all the way to the edge. She collected her bag from the locker room. She changed out of her scrubs in 2 minutes flat. She stood in front of the small mirror above the sink for a moment, not primping, just looking. And the woman looking back at her was 41 years old with dark circles she no longer noticed, and a stillness in her face that had taken her a long time to stop reading as hardness. She walked out through the ambulance bay exit because it was faster and because old habits about exits died slowly. Farrow and Odom were at the SUV. She got in the back without being asked. The briefing location was 40 minutes outside of Denton, a logistics facility that occupied an unmarked building off a 2-lane road that saw almost no traffic, the kind of place that existed in every region of the country doing something that it didn't advertise. Inside, it was warmer than the evening air, lit with the institutional fluorescence of a place designed for function rather than comfort. There were folding tables, secure laptops, a coffee maker that appeared to have been purchased sometime in the previous decade and had the look of something that had kept a lot of people upright through a lot of long nights. 3 other people were in the room. One Diane recognized as a signals intelligence analyst she'd worked with briefly, a woman named Priya Suresh, who acknowledged her with a nod that confirmed the recognition was mutual. The other 2 she didn't know. They gave her a coffee she didn't ask for. She drank it. Then they showed her the situation. It took 40 minutes to brief it fully. There were maps, photographs, intercepts that had been partially decoded, and a timeline that covered the last 9 months of an operation that had, somewhere in that 9 months, gone wrong in a way that nobody had been able to fully diagram yet. The operational thumbnail was this: a classified medical support unit, not her old unit, but one that had worked parallel to it, had been embedded with a joint task force conducting operations in a region she was not going to name. And 3 weeks ago, that unit had gone dark. No contact, no distress signal, nothing that could be confirmed as a termination event, and nothing that could be confirmed as anything else. The task force had assets on the ground still moving. There were injured personnel. The medical capacity to reach them required someone with a specific combination of skills and clearances that, after an 8-month lapse in her records, Diane still technically held. She had listened to all of this without speaking. When Pharaoh finished, she set down the coffee cup. "How many personnel unaccounted for?" she asked. 11, Suresh said. 7 confirmed mobile, 4 unknown status. Last signal? 19 days ago. Relay station in the eastern corridor. Who's running the retrieval? That's the second problem, Odom said from across the table. She looked at him. The retrieval team was assembled 2 weeks ago, he said. They're trained, they're ready. What they don't have is a medical lead who can make split-second triage calls in a low-resource environment and manage the movement of potentially critical casualties across terrain that doesn't allow for standard evacuation protocol. She understood what was being left unsaid. "You're not asking me to go in?" "No," Pharaoh said. "You're asking me to run medical coordination for extraction." "From a forward position," Odom said. "Stationary, not field mobile." "But forward." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The room was very still. Outside, through the thin walls of the building, she could hear the sound of the highway in the distance, the ordinary, ongoing sound of a world that didn't know any of this was happening. "Why wasn't this handled internally?" she asked. Pharaoh and Odom exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, but contained something she couldn't fully read. "The internal chain has a problem," Suresh said carefully. "Define the problem." Another half-second look between the two men. "Someone in the chain has been feeding positional information," Suresh said. "We don't know who, and until we do, the operation can't be run through normal coordination. It has to be—" She paused, choosing the word lateral. Diane looked at the maps on the table. "You're running this off-book." "We're running it through a parallel authorization structure," Pharaoh said, "which is the same thing with better paperwork." Nobody argued with that. She pulled the map closer. She looked at the terrain, the timeline, the last known positions. She did this for 3 minutes without speaking, and the people in the room let her because they had been told, or had figured out, that interrupting this particular process was counterproductive. Then she looked up. "I need the full medical profiles on the 7 confirmed mobile personnel," she said. "I need the equipment manifest for the retrieval team, and I need to know who else knows this location." 2 additional people in Portland, Pharaoh said. "Both cleared, both outside the chain we're concerned about." "And the thread?" she asked Odom. "The one someone else pulled." His jaw moved slightly. "We traced it to a contractor with connections to the Defense Procurement Office. We believe it was information gathering rather than active tracking. We believe." "You believe?" "We've been moving carefully." She sat back. She looked at the ceiling once. The habit of someone thinking in a space where the ceiling gave them nothing to look at, just somewhere neutral to point their eyes while they worked through the angles. She had 3 years invested in Denton, a small apartment with a leaking bathroom faucet she'd never gotten around to fixing. A routine that felt, on good days, like something close to a life. Patients who would show up tomorrow and find a different nurse, which was fine. That was how hospitals worked. Patients didn't need her specifically. They needed someone. She had spent 3 years telling herself that. "I'm not re-enlisting," she said. "This isn't a re-enlistment request," Pharaoh said. "Contracted support?" "Temporary. 1 operation. Defined timeline." "And when it's done?" "You come back," Odom said. "Or you don't. Your call." She looked at him. He had been the one to train her into a unit that asked more of its people than she would have believed possible before she joined it. And he had the good sense to look slightly uncomfortable saying the words, "your call." Because both of them knew that in this context, the phrase was only approximately true. "I want the personnel files by morning," she said. "I'm not agreeing to anything tonight." "That's fair," Farrow said. She stood. Odom drove her back to Denton. They didn't speak for most of the drive, which was fine. They had learned how to be quiet together a long time ago. He dropped her at the apartment building 2 blocks from the hospital. She got out. He started to say something, and she shook her head slightly, not unkindly, and went inside. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor. She unlocked it, turned on the light above the kitchen counter, and stood in the middle of the main room for a moment, just taking inventory of the space. The small couch, the bookshelf that was actually organized because she couldn't help it, the single-framed photograph on the wall that was not of a person but of a mountain range she had seen on a drive through Central Oregon and stopped to look at because it had reminded her, briefly, of another mountain range in another place. And the reminder had been almost entirely painful, but also, just slightly, like something she didn't want to let go of. She sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her phone, and she thought about 11 people. She thought about 7 who were mobile and 4 whose status was unknown. She thought about 19 days. She drank the water. She didn't sleep well. She didn't expect to. She was back at Callaway Regional at 6:55 the next morning, 4 minutes before the start of her shift, and she moved through the locker room and into the department with the same unhurried efficiency that she brought to every morning, which was the efficiency of someone who had decided, at some point in the night, to finish what she was in the middle of before she decided what came next. The department was busy. It was a Wednesday, which at Callaway Regional meant the accumulated medical decisions that people had put off through the weekend and Monday and Tuesday were arriving all at once, combined with the ongoing stream of emergencies that didn't respect scheduling. She took report from the night nurse. She walked the department. She got to work. At 8:40, Dr. Greer arrived and moved through the department with the slightly elevated attention of a man who had spent part of his previous evening looking at a personnel file and not finding satisfying answers. He passed Diane twice without saying anything, which was normal. On the 3rd pass, he stopped. "I'd like to speak with you this afternoon," he said, "before end of shift." "All right," she said, without looking up from the chart. "Nothing serious," he added, which was the thing people said when they meant something they hadn't decided how to frame yet. She nodded and moved on to the next bay. The shift produced, by 11 o'clock, a compound fracture that required ortho consult, a pediatric asthma case that she escalated ahead of the resident's timeline by 12 minutes and was later confirmed correct, a chest pain case that turned out to be musculoskeletal but required full workup protocol, and a man in his 50s who came in convinced he was having a stroke and turned out to be severely dehydrated, who cried slightly when told he was going to be fine and apologized for crying, and whom Diane told, with complete sincerity, not to apologize. At 11:38, 2 things happened within about 90 seconds of each other. The first was that Sandra Tully, who was covering a hospitalist shift, appeared at the nurse's station with a set of labs in her hand and an expression that suggested she'd found something that didn't fit. She caught Diane's attention and said quietly, "Can I pull you for 30 seconds?" The second was that Diane's personal phone in her pocket vibrated with a text that consisted of 3 numbers and no other content, a code she had not received in 3 years, which meant the timeline that Odom had declined to specify the night before had just been specified. She looked at Sandra. She looked at her phone screen. "Give me the labs," she said to Sandra. Sandra handed them over. Diane looked at them for 8 seconds and said, "Potassium and magnesium, both arms, repeat now. And get a cardiology consult on the phone, don't wait for in person." Sandra was already moving. "That's what I thought. I just wanted—" "You were right," Diane said. "Go." She put her phone back in her pocket. The next 4 hours were the last 4 hours of her shift, and she treated them the same way she treated every shift, completely, without abbreviation, without letting anything that was happening outside the department walls affect the quality of what she was doing inside them. This was not performance. It was the same operational discipline that had kept people alive in conditions significantly worse than a busy emergency department in Denton, Oregon, and it was, she had come to understand, not separable from who she was. She could set it aside temporarily. She could not set it down. At 3:45, she went to Greer's office. She knocked. He called her in. He was sitting at his desk with his coat on and the slightly arranged expression of someone who had prepared for this conversation. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Sit down." She sat. He had a folder in front of him. She couldn't see what was in it, but she could see from its thickness that it was not her personnel file. I want to be transparent with you, he said, which was what people said when they had been doing something they weren't sure they should have been doing. After yesterday's visit, I made some inquiries. She waited. I contacted the state nursing board to verify some of your credentials, he said. Routine. And I reached out to 2 of the facilities listed in your employment history. She said nothing. The first facility confirmed your employment, he said. The second, he paused. The second number was disconnected. I looked the facility up. There's no record of a clinic by that name operating in Laramie, Wyoming. The room was quiet. Dr. Greer, she said. I'm not accusing you of anything, he said quickly. I want to be clear about that. But I have an obligation to the hospital, and if there are discrepancies in staff credentials, I understand your obligation, she said. Then can you explain? No, she said. He blinked. I can't explain it to you, she said. Not because I'm hiding something dangerous. Because the explanation requires context I'm not authorized to provide to you. The silence that followed this was the kind that had weight. Diane. His voice had shifted, less formal now, and she recognized that she was seeing something real underneath the hierarchy for once. I'm not trying to create a problem for you. I just need to understand what's happening in my department. I know, she said, and I'm telling you that you won't get that understanding from me. If you want to escalate this to hospital administration, that's your right. But whatever inquiry follows will hit a wall, and that wall is not something I built to deceive you. It's structural. He stared at her. She stood. I'm going to need to request emergency personal leave starting tomorrow. How long? I don't know yet. He opened his mouth and closed it. He was a man who needed information to function, and she was giving him none. And he knew, she could see that he knew, that pressing harder was not going to change this. All right, he said finally. His voice had gone quiet. I'll process the leave request. Thank you. She was at the door. Diane. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was not managerial. It was something more confused than that, and more honest. The man yesterday, Prentice, he asked me to pass along that he wants to thank you personally when he's out of the ICU. She held that for a second. Tell him to focus on his recovery, she said. She walked out. She didn't go back to the locker room immediately. She went to Bay 3, which was currently empty, and stood there for a moment in the empty bay with the flickering fluorescent above Bay 4 running its familiar cycle on the other side of the curtain. And she thought about Harold Prentice and Cody with his cast color options, and Ruth Ellison and her azaleas and Torres with his nail gun injury, and the small, ordinary, non-classified weight of 3 years of caring for people in a building where the chairs had torn armrests and the lights needed fixing, and nobody asked questions about the night nurse's shift, and the coffee in the break room was reliably terrible. She thought about 11 people. Then she collected her things and left the building. Odom was not in the parking lot. The black SUV was not there. What was there, parked across the street from the hospital entrance, was a dark gray sedan she hadn't seen yesterday, with a driver who did not move when she appeared and did not look away when she looked directly at the vehicle. She memorized the plate number and the time it took her to walk to her own car. She drove home. She packed a bag. She had done this before and she was fast at it. Specific clothing, specific equipment, nothing unnecessary. The bag was the size of something you could carry on a plane. She had learned the hard way what happened when you brought more than you could move quickly with. She left most of the apartment as it was. She turned off the bathroom light she'd left on for 3 years out of habit. She stood at the door for a moment, then closed it behind her and didn't look back. At the bottom of the stairs, she texted Odom the plate number from the sedan. His response came in 40 seconds, not ours. She stopped walking. She stood at the base of the stairs in her apartment building in Denton, Oregon, with a bag on her shoulder and the cold understanding that the thread Odom had said was probably just information gathering had, in the last 24 hours, become something that knew where she slept. Her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. A voice she had never heard before said, very quietly, "We know what you agreed to. We know where they're sending you, and we need you to understand that the 11 people they told you about are not the only ones at risk." The line stayed open. She didn't speak. "There's someone inside the coordination structure," the voice continued. "Not the chain Pharaoh identified. Higher. And they know you've been activated." The stairwell was completely silent. "Who is this?" she said. A pause. Someone who's been watching the same thread they told you was contained, the voice said. It wasn't. The line went dead. Diane stood in the stairwell for 4 seconds. Then she walked out the back exit of the building, which she had identified on her third day in Denton and never used until now, and moved toward the alternate route she had never told anyone about, because old habits about exits were not merely slow to die. They were sometimes the only thing standing between you and whatever was waiting at the front door. She took the back street that ran parallel to the main road, kept close to the building line, and moved at the pace of someone who was late for something ordinary rather than someone who had just received an anonymous warning in a stairwell. The distinction mattered. Running drew attention. Walking with purpose was invisible. She had her phone in her left hand and her bag on her right shoulder, and she was already working through the geometry of the situation. Who could have that number? Who could have known she'd answered Pharaoh's briefing? Who had the capability to track an activation that was supposed to be running through a lateral structure specifically to avoid the compromised chain? The answers she was arriving at were not comfortable. She rounded the corner onto a side street with a laundromat and a closed hardware store and a bar that wouldn't open for another 2 hours. And she stopped in the recessed doorway of the hardware store and called Odom. He answered on the second ring. "I got a call," she said. "Unknown number. Whoever it was knew about the activation." A beat. What did they say? That the thread wasn't contained, that there's someone inside the coordination structure above the chain you identified, and that the 11 aren't the only ones at risk. Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone processing information, the silence of someone managing their response to information they may have already been afraid of. "Odom, I hear you. Is there something you didn't tell me last night?" Another pause that was 3 seconds too long. "There are things I didn't tell you because we didn't have confirmation. Tell me now." "Not on this line." She looked at the street. Empty. The sedan from outside her building could have followed her on foot. Someone on foot she might not have spotted. She didn't like not knowing. "Where's Pharaoh?" she asked. 20 minutes out from your position. I'll redirect him." "No, I'm not going back to the logistics facility. If the activation is burned, that location is burned." "Then where?" She thought for 3 seconds. "The hospital. That's a public location, which is exactly why it works right now. 20 minutes. Bring whatever you didn't tell me last night." She hung up. She went back to the hospital, not through the main entrance but through the ambulance bay. The same way she'd left earlier, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there because she did, technically, until the leave paperwork was processed. The night shift was beginning to settle in. She recognized 2 of the nurses by the station, and they recognized her, and nobody asked questions because Diane coming back for something she'd forgotten was not an unusual event. She went to the family consultation room at the end of the east corridor. Not the one where she'd met Pharaoh and Odom the day before. A different one, smaller, with a window that faced the parking structure and gave her a sight line to the main entrance approach. She sat down. She put her bag on the table. She thought about the voice on the phone. It had been calm. Not the controlled calm of someone trying to sound composed, genuinely measured, the way people spoke when they had rehearsed, not the words but the emotional register. She had heard that register before in people who worked in intelligence functions, where emotional modulation was a professional skill, not a personal one. Whoever had called her was not a panicking civilian who had stumbled onto something. They were trained. They had a reason for reaching her directly rather than going through whatever channel they had to know about the operation, and that reason was almost certainly that the channel itself was what they were warning her about. She was still working through the implications when the door opened and Odom came in, followed by Pharaoh, who had clearly been closer than 20 minutes, which meant he had been staged somewhere nearby, which meant there was something they had expected might require this conversation. She looked at them both. "Sit down," she said. "And start from the part you left out." Pharaoh sat. Odom remained standing for a moment, then sat, which told her the standing was a tell he was managing. "There's a secondary layer to the personnel compromise," Pharaoh said. "How secondary?" "The contractor we identified as pulling the thread on your location. He's not independent. We believe he's operating as an intermediary." "For who?" Odom put a folder on the table. She opened it. Inside were photographs. Surveillance images, mostly, shot at distance with good optics, the grainy specificity of real intelligence photography rather than anything staged. The images showed three individuals at various locations: a parking structure, an airport terminal, what appeared to be a hotel lobby. She looked at the faces. She recognized one of them. Not well. Not personally. By association, through a briefing she had received 4 years ago regarding procurement irregularities in a defense contracting review that had been shelved for reasons that had never been adequately explained to anyone in her unit. "Bridger Nautilus," she said. It wasn't a question. "You know the company," Farrow said. "I know their name came up in a contracting review that went nowhere. What's their connection to the missing unit?" Odom and Farrow exchanged the look she was getting very tired of. "Stop doing that," she said. "The missing unit was operating in an area where Bridger Nautilus has infrastructure interests." "Bats," Odom said. "Logistics assets. There's an argument, and we're not past arguing it, we don't have confirmation, that the unit's position was fed to a third party specifically to disrupt an inspection of those assets that the unit would have been adjacent to. The weight of this landed in the room without drama. So the 11 people, she said carefully, went dark because someone decided their proximity to a contractor's operation was a liability. We think. And the retrieval that you need me for would also bring those personnel back with direct knowledge of what they saw." She closed the folder. "Which means the person inside your coordination structure isn't just protecting bad intelligence. They're protecting a business interest. That's our read. And you're telling me this now because someone else told you first," Odom said. "And that someone knowing about the activation means the window is narrower than we told you last night." She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. Her hands, not the men, the way she sometimes did when she needed a second to let the anger move through without attaching to anything. "You recruited me into an operation," she said, "without giving me the full threat picture." "We gave you what we had confirmed," Farrow said. "You gave me what you calculated I'd accept." She looked up. "That's different." Neither of them denied it. "The timeline," she said. "Real one. Not last night's version." Farrow pulled out a second document. "Retrieval window opens in 61 hours. It's a 12-hour window. After that, the asset position shifts and extraction becomes significantly more complex. 61 hours from now. 58 realistically, accounting for transit." She looked at the window. The parking structure was lit by a series of overhead lamps that created orange pools in the dark. Nothing was moving. "The voice on my phone," she said. "You have a candidate?" "Two possibles," Suresh said. And Diane turned to find that Suresh had come in sometime in the last few minutes and was sitting near the door with a laptop open and the specific self-effacing positioning of someone accustomed to being the person in the room that other people forgot to notice. "Two possibles," Diane repeated. "One is a former signals officer who was cashiered from the relevant chain 8 months ago for raising concerns about the Bridger Nautilus connection through internal channels. His concerns were logged, reviewed, and dismissed. He's been operating independently since." "And the second?" Suresh's expression did something small. "Someone currently inside the structure who's been running a parallel documentation effort for the past 5 months. We don't have a name, we have a pattern." "Could the call have been the second one?" "It's more likely," Suresh said. "The first candidate doesn't have current access to activation protocols. Whoever called you knew you'd been activated within the last 18 hours. Diane absorbed this. "So there's potentially someone inside the compromised structure who is also actively working against the compromise." "Yes." "Which means I can't know who's working which direction until you're already in," Odom said. "Which is not ideal. We know." She stood. She moved to the window and looked at the parking structure for a moment, not because there was anything to see, but because she thought better when she was vertical. The situation was a mess. It was the specific kind of mess that happened when institutional rot got deep enough that the people trying to fix it, and the people trying to exploit it, started using identical methods. Because identical methods were the only ones that worked when the official channels were compromised. You couldn't tell the surgery from the infection by looking at the technique. She had been in analogous situations before. Not identical, but close enough that she knew what they required. They required someone willing to operate in the space where certainty wasn't available. She turned from the window. "I need 3 things," she said. "First, full medical profiles on all 11 personnel, not the summaries, the complete records. Second, I want direct contact with Suresh during the operation, Not routed through Pharaoh's coordination node. Pharaoh opened his mouth. It's not personal, she said. It's structural. If your coordination channel has a leak, I route around it. He closed his mouth. Third, she said, I want to know who the discharge signals officer is. Name and current location. Why? Odom asked. Because if he's been independently monitoring this situation for 8 months, and he's not the one who called me, then someone got to him before I did. And if someone got to him, I want to know what he told them. Odom looked at Pharaoh. This time the look wasn't evasive. It was the look of two people making a decision in real time about how much further the table was going to expand. And his name is Victor Alms, Suresh said, before either of them could answer. Last known location was Medford, Oregon. That was 6 days ago. 6 days is a long time to be unlocated, Diane said. Yes, Suresh said. It is. The room was quiet for a moment. Through the window, a car pulled into the parking structure and its headlights swept across the concrete columns in a slow arc before it found a space and went dark. I'm in, Diane said. Under the terms I just named. Pharaoh nodded. And I want it documented, she said, that I flagged the incomplete threat assessment before agreeing, in whatever record exists of this operation. Documented, Pharaoh said. Then let's talk about the transit plan. They talked for 2 hours. The transit was not straightforward. The route to the forward position required 3 legs, with the middle leg designed to create ambiguity about destination, the standard practice for operations running under potential observation. Suresh walked her through the communications protocol, which used a relay system that bypassed the central coordination node in the specific way that made Pharaoh visibly uncomfortable, because it made his node's role in the operation largely ceremonial. She noted his discomfort and said nothing about it, because discomfort wasn't the same as untrustworthiness, and she needed him functional. The medical equipment manifest was exactly what she'd asked for, complete, detailed, and arrived at by someone with actual field medical experience, rather than a procurement office, which meant it was compact and realistic, rather than comprehensive and aspirational. She went through it item by item and made 6 changes, removing 2 things that would be useless under the likely conditions, and adding 4 things that wouldn't be on a standard manifest because they were specific to the kind of triage you did when you couldn't stabilize before you moved, and you had to make the movement work as part of the treatment. Odom watched her work through the manifest. You haven't slowed down, he said quietly, when the others were occupied with something on Suresh's laptop. She didn't look up from the manifest. Was that a question? Observation. 3 years in an emergency department is not a vacation, she said. It's different work, but it's not less work. I didn't mean the skills, he said. I meant... He stopped. She looked at him. I meant whether you were okay, he said. It came out slightly ungainly, which was unusual for him, and she understood that it was genuine precisely because of that. Ask me after, she said. He nodded and left it there, which was the right call. They broke at midnight. Departure was set for 4 in the morning. Diane spent the intervening hours on a cot in a back room of the logistics facility that someone had set up with the minimal comfort of a place that expected to be used for this exact purpose. Thin mattress, 1 blanket, a lamp with a functioning bulb. She did not sleep deeply. She slept the way she had learned to sleep in situations like this. On the surface, monitoring, the way certain animals maintained consciousness, even at rest because the environment required it. She woke at 3:40, which was when she meant to wake, and she dressed in the dark from the bag she'd packed and went to find coffee. Suresh was already up, working at the folding table with the specific focus of someone who had also not slept well, but had converted the sleeplessness into productivity. Victor Alms, Diane said, pouring coffee. Suresh looked up. Still no contact. What was the last signal? Location, communication, anything. A burner phone used to access a secured communications app. The app was one used by former personnel from the signals intelligence community. The message he sent was flagged by the monitoring system. He was asking another former colleague whether they'd heard anything about a retrieval operation in the Eastern Corridor. Suresh paused. That was 6 days ago. Who was the colleague? Someone inside the current structure. Diane set down the coffee. Inside the compromise chain? We don't know which side they're on, Suresh said, which is the same problem all the way down. Diane looked at the laptop screen. not trying to read it, just giving herself somewhere to look while she reorganized the picture. Victor Alms had been asking questions about the retrieval operation 6 days ago. Someone currently inside the structure received those questions. 6 days later, Alms was unlocated, and Diane had received an anonymous call warning her that the operation's cover was blown. Either Alms was the call, which contradicted Suresh's analysis about access to activation protocols, or Alms had told his contact something, and the contact had used that information in a direction that was not what Alms intended. Or Alms was dead. She did not say this out loud because Suresh had clearly already considered it, and saying it accomplished nothing. "Do you have the medical profiles?" she asked. Suresh passed her a sealed envelope. She took it to the cot room and read every page under the lamp with the functioning bulb, making no notes because she didn't need to. Building a picture of 11 people, their blood types, their injury histories, their known medication responses and allergies, the old fractures and surgeries, and the physiological facts that would matter if she was making decisions about them in a moving vehicle in poor light with limited supplies and no ability to call for backup. 7 of them she could reasonably manage with what was on the equipment manifest she'd adjusted. 3 of the 4 unknowns had histories that flagged specific concerns, one with a cardiac event 2 years prior, one with a blood clotting disorder that required specific management, one who had reported severe reactions to a class of antibiotics that was standard in field kits and would need to be manually removed from anything she prepared. The 4th unknown had a file that was largely redacted. She looked at the redacted file for a moment. Redaction in this context meant clearance level, not relevance. Whatever was in the blacked out sections, someone had decided she didn't need it. She filed this in the category of things she couldn't control and moved on. At 4, they loaded into 2 vehicles and left the logistics facility in darkness. The first leg of transit was 3 hours by vehicle, moving southeast on roads that were empty at this hour in the way that rural Oregon roads were empty, genuinely, with no traffic and no infrastructure, and the particular darkness that came from being far enough from any city that the sky showed all of its stars when the cloud cover broke. Diane sat in the back of the first vehicle with the equipment cases and the sealed personnel files and her bag, and she watched the darkness go past outside the window, and she thought about the hospital she'd left, and about Pauline at the station, and about the man who would handle Cody's cast follow-up, and about Harold Prentice in the ICU hoping to say thank you. She thought about whether she was making the right decision. She did not arrive at a clean answer, which was accurate because clean answers to questions like this were not a real thing, and she had long since stopped expecting them. The second leg was a small charter flight from a private airfield that had no scheduled commercial service and no visible signage from the road. The pilot knew Faro and did not speak to Diane at all, which was fine. The flight was 4 hours, and she spent most of it reviewing the communication protocols with Suresh over a hardened tablet that operated on a frequency she hadn't used in 3 years, but that her hands and her eyes found as naturally as any skill that had been drilled past the point of forgetting. The third leg began at a staging area she was not going to locate more precisely than that. The retrieval team was 7 people. She met them at the staging area. They had been briefed on her role, and they received her with the specific professionalism of trained personnel who have been told to expect a specialist and have decided to form their own opinion after they see the specialist work. She did not try to win them over. She introduced herself, explained her role, asked 2 questions about the terrain they were moving into, and let their answers tell her what she needed to know about how they communicated under pressure. The team leader was a man named Braddock. 30s, compact, the kind of face that didn't display a default expression. It was just neutral until it needed to be something else. He had the easy physical confidence of someone who had done this enough times to stop being scared by the concept, and was now only appropriately scared by the specifics. You've run medical coordination for extraction before? He asked her. Yes. Under fire? Yes. He looked at her for a moment, not challengingly, assessing the way she had assessed him. All right, he said, and turned back to the map table. She took that as what it was, conditional acceptance. She would prove it through the work, which was the only kind of proof that mattered in this context anyway. The forward position was established at a facility she would describe only as a structure with 4 walls and a roof that had been used for other things before it was used for this. The retrieval was planned to begin at dawn the following day, which gave them approximately 14 hours to finalize the approach plan, pre-stage medical supplies, and deal with the two equipment failures that were discovered during the setup and that required improvisation she had been through enough times to handle without drama. At 9 that evening, Suresh reached her on the relay channel. "We have a problem," Suresh said. Diane had been arranging the medical supplies station. She set down what she was holding. "Talk." "Victor Alms made contact, not with us, with Bridger Nautilus." She kept her voice level. "Voluntarily?" "We don't know. The contact was a meeting, physical, not digital. A Bridger Nautilus representative met with someone matching Alms's description at a location in Northern California. We have imagery from an asset in the area. Send it. Already on the tablet." She pulled up the tablet. The imagery was what it was, is surveillance photography, distance optics, two figures at an outdoor location. She studied the images for 30 seconds. The person matching Alm's description had the specific posture of someone who was not having the meeting by choice. The subtle tells were there if you knew what to look for. The weight distribution, the position of the hands, the angle of the head relative to the other figure. "He's not there voluntarily," she said. "That's our read too." "Which means the call I received wasn't him." "No." "And whoever called me is still unidentified," Suresh said. "And now we have to consider the possibility that they called you knowing that Alms was already compromised, that they were warning you specifically because they knew what Alms told them," Diane finished. "About the operation. About me." "Yes." Diane set the tablet down. 14 hours until the retrieval window opened. 11 people in a position that someone with Bridger Nautilus money and motive now had additional information about. A team of 7 who were good at their jobs but didn't yet know that the threat picture had just shifted in a way that could change the approach entirely. She went to find Braddock. He was at the map table with 2 of his team, working through the third route option for the approach. "We need to talk," she said. He looked at her face and closed the map. "Team," he said, "give us a minute." They cleared the table. Diane told him what Suresh had told her. She told him clearly, without editorializing, without escalating the emotional register of the information beyond what was warranted. She laid it out the way she laid out a clinical finding. Here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what it changes. Braddock listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The approach route has a choke point at the eastern axis," he said. "I saw it on the map. If they have updated positional information, the choke point becomes a problem," she said. "What's your medical read on an alternative approach? The northern route is longer, but it avoids the choke point. It adds about 40 minutes to the extraction. For anyone who's been in that position for 19 days, depends on what we find when we get there," she said. 40 minutes is manageable if the casualties are stable. If they're not stable, 40 minutes could be the difference. So we need to know their status before we commit to a route." "Yes." "We have no contact." "I know." Braddock put his hands on the table. He looked at the map for a moment. "I'm going to send a 2-person advance element," he said. "Get eyes on the position before we commit the full team." "Timeline?" "They move in 2 hours. Report back in 6. That still gives us a window before dawn." She nodded. "I want to know the moment they make contact with anyone in that position. You'll be the second call after me." He started to reassemble his team. She went back to the medical supply station and continued what she'd been doing before Suresh's call, because the supplies needed to be ready regardless of which route they took and regardless of what the advance element found. At 11:40, the relay channel opened. Suresh's voice, and this time the measured quality was working harder than usual. "Diane, the coordination node." A pause that lasted 1 second too long. Pharaoh's node just went dark. She stopped moving. "Define dark," she said. "No signal, no response to protocol checks. It dropped 6 minutes ago." The facility was quiet. Outside, the advance element had left an hour ago. Braddock was in the next room with his remaining 5. "Is Pharaoh?" "We don't know," Suresh said. "We don't know if it's a technical failure or a compromise." "Yes." Diane looked at the medical supplies in front of her. The IVs staged and labeled. The field surgical kit. The medications sorted by situation, by casualty type, by the specific calculus of people who had been in a position for 19 days and might need anything. "Suresh," she said, "if the node is compromised, how long before our relay is traced?" A pause. "We're already rotating. But if someone with Bridger Nautilus resources is actively working the signal, another pause. Maybe 4 hours. Maybe less. Diane looked at the door. 4 hours. 6 hours until the advance element was due back. A retrieval window that opened at dawn. She did the math. She went to Braddock. "We're moving the timeline," she said. He looked up from the table. "The advance is still in the field. We're moving up regardless." He went still. "That's a significant deviation from—" "I know what it is," she said. "Our coordination node is down. If it's compromised, we have a hard ceiling on how long this position is secure. We cannot be here when that ceiling hits." Braddock looked at her. The conditional acceptance from earlier was doing something now, recalibrating in real time against the information she was delivering and the way she was delivering it. "If we move without the advance elements report, we go in without knowing their status," she said. "Yes, which means we prepare for the worst case medically, and we take the northern route to avoid the choke point. The northern route adds 40 minutes. I know. And if the casualties aren't stable, then I handle it in the field," she said. "That's what I'm here for." He held her gaze. Outside, somewhere in the dark, his advance element was moving through terrain without knowing that the picture behind them had just changed significantly. He made his decision in the way people with operational authority made decisions under time pressure. Not comfortably, not with any sense that all the variables were accounted for, but with the understanding that waiting for comfort was a decision too, and usually a worse one. "We move in 90 minutes, he said. She went back to the supply station and began consolidating for rapid movement, a different configuration than the staged setup she'd built for a position extraction, built instead for something faster and less certain. The configuration she would have described to a medical student as, "Assume nothing is how you left it, and be ready for everything." At 12:54, the relay channel opened. It was not Suresh. It was a voice she did not recognize. It said 3 words, in a code format she had not used in 4 years, that only someone with access to her previous unit's internal protocol library could have known. 3 words that meant, "Abort the extraction." She looked at the relay device in her hand. Then she looked at the door of the facility, beyond which Braddock's team was gearing up, and the northern route was waiting in the dark. And beyond that, somewhere out there, were 11 people who had been waiting for 19 days. And she made a decision that she understood, with complete clarity, might be the kind of decision that defined everything that came after it. She set the relay device down on the supply table. 3 words. A code format from a protocol library that had been decommissioned 4 years ago, which meant whoever used it had either retained access to archived material that was supposed to be destroyed or had been inside the unit long enough to have memorized it before the decommission. The first possibility pointed toward institutional access. The second pointed toward someone who had been there. Neither option made the message easier to dismiss. Abort the extraction. She stood there for 6 seconds, which was long enough to think it through twice and arrive at the same place both times. If the message was legitimate, if someone with genuine knowledge of the situation and genuine authority to use that code was telling her to stop, then proceeding meant walking a team of 7 people and potentially 11 casualties into a situation that the people with the fullest picture had decided was not survivable. If the message was not legitimate, if it was generated by someone who had enough access to the decommissioned protocol library to fake the format, but whose actual goal was to stop the extraction, then stopping meant leaving 11 people in a position that had already been held for 19 days, with a window that would close at dawn and not reopen in any timeline that mattered. She picked up the relay device. "Suresh," she said on the channel. Suresh responded in 4 seconds. "I'm here." "Did you send a message on this channel in the last 3 minutes?" "No." "Did anyone in the coordination structure?" A pause. "The node is still dark, Diane. No authorized transmissions from our end in the last hour. Someone used the old Phoenix protocol format. Abort message." Longer pause. "That format's been decommissioned." "I know." "The only people who'd have that format are people who were inside the unit," Diane said, "or people who got it from someone who was." "Victor Alms," Suresh said. His name landed between them like a stone. Alms had been signals intelligence. He had worked adjacent to Diane's unit. Whether he had memorized the internal protocol before the decommission, or whether someone who now had him in a room in Northern California had extracted it from him in the last 6 days, the result was the same. Bridger Nautilus had the abort code, and they had used it. They want us to stop, Diane said, which means they don't have the position. What? If they already had the position, if they'd fed enough information to someone to compromise the extraction site, they wouldn't need us to abort. They'd just be waiting for us. She felt the logic of it settle into place, the way a clinical diagnosis settled when the evidence aligned. They know we've been activated. They know roughly what we're doing, but they don't know where the 11 are, which means the forward element went dark in a way that protected the position. That's possible, Suresh said. It's also possible they want you to continue so they can follow you there. Also possible, she acknowledged. She looked at the door again. Braddock's team was 90 seconds from stepping out of this building. I need you to run signal analysis on the abort transmission, she said. Origin point, relay pathway, whatever you can pull in the next 4 minutes. Working. She went to the door and opened it. Braddock was standing at the far end of the room with his team assembled around the map table, running a final check on the approach route. He looked up when she came in. Something in her face made him straighten slightly. Hold the timeline, she said. He held it. His team went still without being told to, because they were professionals who understood that a medical coordinator saying hold meant something specific had changed. 4 minutes, she told him. He nodded once. She went back to the relay. Suresh came back in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The transmission was bounced through 4 relays, Suresh said. I can't get origin on the first relay, but I can tell you the last 2 hops were through commercial satellite infrastructure that Bridger Nautilus subsidiaries use. So it's them. The signal pattern is consistent. Diane breathed out through her nose. Suresh, if Bridger Nautilus used the abort code to stop the extraction, what does that buy them? Time, Suresh said immediately. If the forward element comes back and reports the position is clear and you abort without extracting, the 11 people stay in that position. The window closes. Re-extraction requires a new authorization cycle, which goes through the main chain, the compromise chain, Diane said. Yes. So the abort code is the mechanism, she said, not to stop us directly, to route everything back through the channel they control. She went to Braddock. We're going, she said. He didn't ask. He turned to his team. Northern route, 90 seconds. The northern approach took them through terrain that was harder underfoot than the map suggested. Rocky ground with a thin layer of loose material over it that made movement noisier and slower than planned. Braddock's team moved anyway, making the adjustments in real time that good field personnel made, redistributing weight and spacing and pace without stopping to discuss it. Diane moved with them. She had done this before and her body remembered how even if 3 years in an emergency department had done nothing for her knees, which ached in the cold in a way they hadn't before. She noted this the way she noted everything, registering it, filing it, not assigning it more significance than it had. The advance element had reported in 40 minutes ago. Their transmission had been brief and encrypted, position confirmed, 7 mobile, access compromised on eastern approach, north is open. Then silence, because their job was to pull back and let the main team come in, not to maintain open channels that could be traced. She had the medical picture from that transmission, 7 mobile, 4 unknown status. The advance element had not been able to get eyes on the 4. She kept walking. The facility came into view at 0417, a structure that had been something industrial before it was anything else, long and low, with a corrugated roof that had partially collapsed at one end, set against a hillside in a way that provided natural concealment from 3 directions and a single viable approach from the north. Someone had chosen this position well. That was the kind of choice that told you something about the people who made it. Braddock hand signaled. The team spread in practiced silence. Diane moved to the position Braddock had assigned her. Inside the perimeter, rear of the structure, close enough to the main entry point to receive casualties as they came out. She set the medical bag down. She opened it. She arranged what she needed in the sequence she would need it, in the dark, by touch. Because this was something she had done enough times that the dark was not a complication. She heard the entry. Not loudly. Braddock's team was quieter than that. But she heard the shape of it, the movement of the door, the brief exchange of challenge, response identification. The absence of resistance that meant the people inside were expecting someone from the outside to eventually come. 19 days, she thought. 19 days expecting someone. They started bringing people out 12 minutes after entry. The first 3 were mobile but not well. Dehydration, exhaustion, the specific fragility of people who had been managing their own health with minimal resources for an extended period and were now in the process of discovering how much the management had been costing them. She assessed each one in under 2 minutes, made decisions, flagged the one with the cardiac history for priority monitoring, got fluids going. The 4th person out was ambulatory, but had a leg injury that had been field dressed and redressed several times over 19 days with whatever was available, which was not enough. Diane looked at it in the low light, peeled back the dressing carefully, and understood immediately that they had perhaps 6 hours before the infection that had already started would move past the point where field management was a realistic option. "When did this start presenting?" she asked him. "Day 8, maybe 9, he said. "I was young. Late 20s, she thought, though it was hard to tell under the condition and the low light. "We did what we could." "You did well," she said, because they had, within the limits of what they had, and because it was true. "I'm going to give you something for the pain and start antibiotics now. Don't move the leg." "I wasn't planning on it," he said. "Good." The 5th through 7th came out together. 2 of them were in better shape than expected. 1 was not. She was a woman in her 40s. Diane knew from the medical profiles that her name was Strand, that she had the blood clotting disorder, and that she had been carrying a supply of her maintenance medication when the unit went dark. The supply was gone. She had been 19 days without it. Diane looked at what she had on the manifest, ran the calculus, and made a decision that was not on any protocol, but was correct. 2 medications combined in a way that was off-label but medically defensible and the best available option in the current conditions. She administered it and watched Strand for the next 3 minutes while the rest of the team continued the extraction, because this was the kind of intervention that either worked quickly or produced a complication that needed immediate management. It worked. Strand's vitals stabilized in the way that indicated the intervention had hit the right mechanism. Diane noted this without celebration, because there was still work. 8, 9, 10. The 10th person out was one of the 4 unknowns. I was conscious but barely. A young specialist whose file had been largely redacted, and who turned out, when she assessed him, to have a traumatic head injury that had been sustained at some point in the 19 days and had been managed with exactly nothing, because head injuries required imaging and care that did not exist in this position. He was responsive to voice. He could tell her his name. His pupils were unequal. She called to Braddock without raising her voice. "He needs surgical intervention within 2 hours." "Understood," Braddock said from across the space. "Transit is staged. He cannot wait for the standard route." "I know." The 11th person. They brought him out last, and the person who brought him out was one of Braddock's team members, moving with the careful, controlled speed that meant the person being moved could not contribute to their own movement. The 11th person was Colonel Dennis Farrow. Diane had not known he was one of the 11. She understood, looking at him now, that this was why his coordination node had gone dark, not because of a compromise in the signal infrastructure, but because Farrow had been in this position for 19 days and the node had gone dark when he did. He was conscious. He recognized her. His color was not good. "Carter," he said, which was a name that appeared in her file from before Calloway, and which she had not heard anyone say in 3 years, and which landed in her chest like a physical thing. "Don't talk," she said. She started her assessment. He had 2 fractured ribs. She could tell from the way he was breathing, the shallow compensation pattern, and something going on in his abdomen that she didn't like. A guarding response that suggested possible internal bleeding or organ involvement. She pressed carefully, watched his face, noted where the response sharpened. "How long has this been presenting?" she asked. 4 days, he said. "On a scale?" 7, he said, before she finished. "Mostly when I breathe." "Then don't breathe deeply. I mean that. Small breaths." She made decisions. She administered what she could administer in the field, which was not enough but was something, and she flagged him as priority 2 behind the head injury, because the head injury was closer to a hard ceiling and Farrow's abdominal presentation, while Sirius still had a window. She was in the process of establishing the transport order when Suresh's voice came through her earpiece. It had been silent since they moved out, because the channel had been in receive-only mode to avoid transmissions during approach. "Diane," Suresh said, "I need to tell you something. I'm in the middle of I know, this won't wait." Diane kept her hands working on Pharaoh's IV line while she listened. "We traced the second relay node from the abort transmission," Suresh said. "The one I couldn't get origin on. I ran a longer analysis." "And?" "The transmission originated in the United States. Domestic. And the specific satellite infrastructure it routed through is registered to a shell company, but the shell company," a pause, "traces back to a holding entity connected to a defense procurement office that has been under internal audit for 7 months." "You told me about that audit," Diane said. "The Bridger-Nautilus connection." "The audit was initiated by a whistleblower complaint," Suresh said, "filed 9 months ago. I have the name of the person who filed it." "Who?" "Colonel Dennis Farrow." Diane's hand stopped moving for exactly 1 second. She looked at Farrow. He was watching her face. He had heard the name from her earpiece, or read something in the way she had stopped, because his eyes were doing the thing that people's eyes did when they were waiting to find out whether something they had been carrying for a long time was about to surface. "He filed the complaint 9 months ago," Suresh continued, "and 6 weeks after filing, his unit was tasked with an operation that placed them in proximity to Bridger-Nautilus assets. 3 weeks into that operation, the unit went dark." She looked at Farrow. "You were trying to expose them," she said. He said nothing. "Farrow, the whistleblower complaint, 9 months ago." "I'm aware of what I filed," he said quietly. "And you recruited me for an extraction of a unit that went dark because of information you provided that pointed at Bridger-Nautilus." "I recruited you because you're the best field medical coordinator I know," he said, "and because the people in that position deserve to come home." "And because it would create a documented record," she said slowly, working it out as she said it, "of the extraction. A record that would go into the same investigation file as the whistleblower complaint and add operational corroboration to the documented evidence." His expression did not confirm or deny this, which was confirmation. "You used the extraction," she said. "I ran the extraction," he said. There's a difference." "Not from where I'm standing right now." "No," he said. "I suppose not." She held the IV line in her hand and she was angry. Genuinely, specifically angry in the way that happened when you discovered that something you had decided to do for one reason had actually been shaped by someone else's agenda. And the anger was real and it was warranted, and she also understood, with the clinical clarity that was the least convenient aspect of her own character, that none of this changed the position of the 11 people she had just spent the last hour assessing and stabilizing. "We'll have this conversation later," she said. "I know," he said. She finished the IV line. She organized the transport order and communicated it to Braddock, who executed without question, which was one of the things about Braddock that she was grateful for. The specialist with the head injury went first, Strand second, Farrow third. The rest in a sequence she had determined based on stability and risk of deterioration over the transit time. The transit out was 47 minutes on the northern route. The vehicles were staged where Braddock's plan had staged them, and they were there when the team arrived, which was not guaranteed and which Diane noted with something close to relief, because plans that depended on vehicles being where you left them in uncertain conditions were plans that could fail at the last step. She rode in the vehicle with the head injury case and Farrow because those were the two that needed the most active monitoring during transit. The specialist, whose name she had learned in the last hour, was Devin Marsh, 26 years old, from somewhere in the Midwest she couldn't remember, held through the transit without deterioration. His pupils remained unequal, but his responses were consistent, which meant the injury was serious but not cascading. Farrow rode in silence for most of the transit, managing his breathing in the small, careful way she had told him to. At the 20-minute mark, he said, "The abort code." "Bridger-Nautilus." "You figured that out." "Yes." "And you kept going." "Obviously." He was quiet for a moment. "I wouldn't have been certain. In your position, with that transmission, I was certain enough," she said. "That's all certain means in the field. Enough to act on." He considered this. "The complaint goes to the Oversight Committee in 11 days, he said. "The investigation has been building for 9 months. What happened to the unit, what happened to the 11, is now material evidence of what Bridger Nautilus is willing to do to protect its interests. I understand that. The people who went into that position came out tonight, he said, and they'll testify, all of them. 7 of them can probably testify in 11 days, she said. The rest will need time. We have enough, he said. She didn't respond to that because it wasn't a medical statement and she was currently focused on medical things, and also because she had thoughts about being used as a component in someone's legal strategy without full disclosure that she was not ready to organize into conversation. At the Forward Medical Facility, a legitimate structure this time, staffed and equipped, operating under a separate clearance from the compromised chain, she handed off each patient with the specificity she always used. Complete information, flagged concerns, the off-label intervention with Strand, documented and explained. Marcia's neurostatus, the last 3 assessments logged in sequence so the receiving surgical team could see the trajectory and not just the current state. She did this for every person they had brought out until the last one was handed off, and she was standing in a hallway of the facility with the empty medical bag at her feet and the dawn coming in through the small window at the end of the hall. She sat down on the floor because there was no chair within immediate reach, and her knees had been telling her something about this decision for the last 3 hours, and the floor was available. She sat there for a while. Braddock found her in the hallway at some point after. He looked at her on the floor, assessed the situation, and sat down on the floor beside her, which she had not expected and which she found, unexpectedly, to be exactly the right thing for someone to do. All 11, he said. Marsh needs surgery, she said. Farrow needs imaging and probably an OR depending on what they find. Strand needs specialized monitoring for at least 72 hours. But all 11. She looked at the window. The dawn was getting more specific, going from gray to the particular pale gold that came before actual color. All 11, she said. They sat there for another minute. Then Braddock said, I've worked with 4 medical coordinators in the field. You're the best I've seen. She didn't say thank you. She said, your team is good. Yeah, he said, they are. That was all of it. They sat there until someone came to tell Braddock that transit to the secondary facility was being staged, and he got up, and she got up, and they went back to the work. The Oversight Committee convened its emergency session not in 11 days, but in 4, because the material that came out of the extraction, the testimony of 10 of the 11, the physical documentation that 2 of them had maintained through the 19 days with the specific discipline of people who understood that what they had seen might eventually need to be proven, was substantial enough that the committee chair exercised emergency scheduling authority. Diane was not at the committee session. She was at the Forward Medical Facility because Marsh had come through surgery and was in a recovery trajectory that she was monitoring with the same attention she gave anything that had been close enough to a hard ceiling that she could still feel the ceiling. She heard about what happened at the committee through Suresh, who sent her a text that contained more words than Suresh usually used in any single communication, which told Diane how significant the session had been before she read the content. The content was this. Bridger Nautilus's chief operating officer, a man named Gerald Spate, had been called to testify before the committee. He had brought 3 lawyers. He had been in the room for 40 minutes before the committee chair presented the operational record, the abort transmission, the signal analysis tracing it to Bridger Nautilus infrastructure, the testimony of the unit personnel regarding what they had observed adjacent to Bridger Nautilus assets in the field, and the 9-month documentation trail from Farrow's original complaint. Spate had asked for a recess after the operational record was presented. The recess was granted. He did not return from the recess with his lawyers. He returned with a separate attorney and a prepared statement indicating his willingness to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for considerations he would negotiate separately. The committee chair had accepted the statement. The separate attorney had asked, for the record, that the committee acknowledge that Spate's cooperation was voluntary. The committee chair had looked at him for a long moment and then said, for the record, that the committee acknowledged it. 2 days later, the name of the person inside the coordination structure who had been feeding positional information to Bridger Nautilus was disclosed in the committee's sealed findings. Diane received a summary through Suresh. The name was someone she had never met, which was either fortunate or incidental. and who had been in a position to feed information because of a procurement liaison role that gave access to operational scheduling without requiring field clearance. The way these things worked, she knew, was that the name would take time to become a public thing, and the public thing would be smaller and less satisfying than the actual facts, and the actual facts would be partially classified for reasons that were partly legitimate and partly institutional self-protection, and nobody would ever entirely know what had happened because nobody ever entirely knew what happened in situations like this. 11 people came home. That part was exact. She was at Marsh's bedside when he was awake enough to have a real conversation. He was 26 and from Davenport, Iowa, and he had a younger sister and a mother who had already been called and was in transit to the facility. He had the specific emotional fragility of someone who had been very close to a thing they could not name, and was now, on the other side of it, still processing the distance. "You were the one who ran the medical," he said. "Yes." "In the field?" "Yes." He looked at the ceiling. "I don't really remember the transport," he said. "I remember coming out of the building, and then I remember this room." "That's fine," she said. "You don't need to remember the transport." "But you were there." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "They told me about the abort code," he said, "that someone sent it." "Yes." "And you kept going." She recognized this as the same thing Pharaoh had said in the vehicle, and she understood that it was becoming part of the story that these people would tell, the abort code that was sent to stop them, and the decision to keep going anyway. She understood also that the story would be larger in the telling than it had been in the doing, because the doing had been a 6-second decision based on incomplete information, and stories preferred certainty. "I made a judgment call," she said. "Based on what?" She thought about this. "Based on 19 days, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I was a day away. Maybe 2. She knew this from his neuro presentation. She didn't confirm or deny it, because confirmation served nothing here. "You're not a day away anymore," she said. He nodded. His mother arrived 6 hours later. Diane was at the nurse's station when they brought her in, and she watched through the window of his room as the reunion happened. The specific, unguarded collapse of a person arriving at the end of something they had been dreading. And she looked away, because this was private in a way that had nothing to do with her. She had forms to complete. She completed them. She was sitting at the nurse's station with the completed forms and a cup of cold coffee when Odom appeared at the end of the corridor. He walked toward her with the slightly less compressed posture of a man who had been carrying something for 8 months and had recently set down a significant portion of it. He sat in the chair across the station counter. "Pharaoh's imaging came back," he said. "Lacerated spleen. They went in last night. He's out of surgery. He'll need 6 weeks minimum before—" "I know," Odom said. "He knows." A pause. "You're angry at him," Odom said. "Yes." "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not particularly." Odom looked at the counter. "He should have told you the full picture. He knew it, and he made a decision that you had a right to make for yourself, and he took it away from you because he thought you wouldn't go in if you knew the full picture." "Would he have been right?" she asked. Odom considered this with the honesty that had always been one of his better qualities. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe." "Maybe," she said. She drank the cold coffee, which was terrible, which was not unlike the coffee at Callaway Regional. "What happens now?" she asked. "The committee investigation continues," he said. "The personnel from the unit will be debriefed as they're medically cleared. Spate's cooperation has already produced 3 additional names in the Bridger Nautilus structure that the committee is pursuing." "For Pharaoh?" "The complaint is now primary evidence rather than initiating document. The committee chair has characterized it as—" Odom paused, recalling the exact language, "foundational to establishing the full scope of the institutional compromise." She absorbed this. "And for me?" she asked. Odom was quiet for a moment. "That's actually why I'm here," he said. His voice had changed slightly. Not evasive, but careful in the way it was careful when he was about to say something that he'd been thinking about how to say for a while. "There's going to be an after-action review. The committee will want testimony about the operation, specifically about the abort transmission and the decision to proceed." "I'll testify." "I know, but there's something else." He put a folder on the counter between them. "The committee chair has asked, informally so far, whether you'd be willing to consult on the investigation, specifically the operational and medical dimensions of what the unit observed in the field. She looked at the folder. It would require an extended commitment, he said. Weeks, probably. Possibly longer. At what clearance level? Whatever you had before, he said. It would be reinstated. She looked at the folder. She didn't open it. Through the window of Marsh's room, his mother was sitting in the chair beside his bed, and Marsh was asleep, and his mother was holding his hand in a way that was so completely without self-consciousness that it was almost uncomfortable to see. And Diane looked at this for a moment. She thought about Callaway Regional, about the flickering light above Bay 4, about the chair with the torn armrest, about Pauline at the nurse's station, and Harold Prentice's daughter calling from the ICU waiting room, and the 8-year-old with his cast color options. She thought about Raymond Greer and the note he had placed in her file about professional communication, which was still in her file right now, sitting in a drawer in his office in Denton, Oregon. She thought about the leave request she had submitted that had no specified end date. She reached out and opened the folder. Inside were 2 documents. The first was the informal consultation request from the committee, which was 2 pages and asked for a response within 10 days. The second was something she had not expected. It was a summary document from the hospital network's regional oversight office. Not Callaway Regional, but the network's central administrative body. And it was dated 3 days ago, and it was addressed to the medical director at Callaway Regional Medical Center, and it contained findings from an operational review of the emergency department that cited, by name, a series of critical clinical interventions over the past 18 months that had resulted in measurable improvements in patient outcomes and which had been documented, according to the summary, primarily through incident reports and clinical logs filed not by the attending physicians, but by nursing staff. Her name appeared 17 times. The summary recommended a formal commendation for clinical excellence. It also recommended a review of the department's management structure in light of documented patterns of clinical obstruction by senior physician staff. She read this twice. She looked at Odom. "Who sent this to you?" she asked. "Bernadette Cole," he said. "The administrator from the regional office who was doing the operational review the day before you left. She completed her report last week. She asked Farrow's office to make sure it reached you." Diane set the document down. Somewhere down the hall, in a room she couldn't see from here, Dennis Farrow was in post-operative recovery with a lacerated spleen that was going to take 6 weeks to heal, and a 9-month whistleblower complaint that was now the center of a committee investigation into something that had sent 11 people into a position they'd spent 19 days trying to survive. Somewhere in Denton, Oregon, Raymond Greer was sitting in his office with her personnel file and a note about professional communication, and now a letter from the regional oversight office that was going to require him to have a conversation he had not prepared for. She looked at the consultation request. She looked at the commendation summary. She looked at Odom. "I need a week," she said. "For which one?" "Both," she said. He nodded. He stood. He picked up his coffee, then looked at hers. "That's cold," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm drinking it anyway." He left. She sat at the counter with the 2 documents in front of her and the cold coffee and the pale light coming through the window at the end of the hall. And she was tired in the specific way that came after something was done that could not be undone. And she was also, underneath the tired, something else. Something she didn't immediately name because she had learned to be careful about naming things too quickly. She looked at the window. Down the corridor, a door opened and a nurse she didn't recognize came out of a patient room and stopped at the station to log something. And the routine movement of a working medical facility continued around her the way it always did, indifferent to what had happened in the last 72 hours, focused entirely on what was happening right now. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was Callaway Regional Medical Center's main switchboard. She answered. "Diane." It was Sandra Tully. Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was about to say something she wasn't sure how to frame. "I'm sorry to call on your personal number. I got it from Pauline." "It's fine. What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong exactly," Sandra said. "I just thought you should know. Dr. Greer received a letter from the Regional Oversight Office this morning." "I heard." It's been a difficult day for him. The letter recommended a management review, and the network sent a formal auditor this afternoon." A pause. "He asked me if I knew where you were." What did you tell him? That I didn't know, Sandra said. Which is true. Another pause. Diane, the auditor asked to see staffing records and incident reports going back 18 months. She spent 3 hours in the records room. When she came out, she asked specifically about the Harold Prentice case. Diane was quiet. She asked who flagged the initial concern, Sandra said. The incident report had your name. She wrote something down. All right, Diane said. I don't know exactly what's happening, Sandra said, but I thought you should know it's happening. Thank you, Sandra. She ended the call. She sat with both documents and the cold coffee and the phone in her hand. She thought about 17 documented interventions. She thought about 11 people who had come home. She thought about a 4-year-old decommissioned abort code used by a defense contractor to stop an extraction of people they had deliberately placed in danger. She thought about 3 years of being nobody's priority and everyone's last resort. She looked at her phone again. There was a message from an unknown number. Not the same unknown number as before, a different one, that had come in while she was on the call with Sandra. She opened it. It contained a single line. The second name on the committee's sealed list is someone you know. She read the message twice. The second name on the committee's sealed list is someone you know. She put the phone face down on the counter. She sat with this for 30 seconds, which was what she allowed herself. 30 seconds to feel the specific unpleasantness of a thing before she decided what to do with it. It was a discipline she had developed not in any formal training, but through the accumulated experience of being in situations where emotional processing had a timer on it, and the timer was usually shorter than anyone wanted. The message could be a manipulation, another Bridger Nautilus move, designed to introduce distrust into whatever remained of the operational structure. Destabilization through implication, a classic technique, one she had seen used before, one that worked precisely because it was unfalsifiable until it wasn't. It could also be the same person who had called her in the stairwell. The unidentified second possibility that Suresh had characterized as someone inside the structure running a parallel documentation effort. Someone who had been trying, through the only channels available to them, to get information to people who could use it. She picked up the phone. She called Suresh. The sealed list, she said when Suresh answered. The second name. Do you have it? A pause. The committee's sealed findings aren't accessible to me directly. Do you have a contact who can get me a name without going through the coordination node? That depends on what's left of the node. Farrow is in post-op, Diane said. Who's running his office? A deputy coordinator named Ellis March. He's been read in on the committee investigation. Call March. Get the second name. Don't route it through anything connected to the main chain. Diane. Suresh's voice was careful. If the sealed list has a second name that's connected to someone involved in this operation, that information is going to change how the committee manages the next phase. I know that, she said, which is why I need it before someone else decides how to manage it for me. Suresh went quiet for a moment. Then, give me 20 minutes. She waited. She did not spend the 20 minutes sitting still. She went back through the ward, checked on Marsh, checked on Strand, checked on Farrow's post-op status through the nursing staff in a way that was professional and not personal, because the personal conversation with Farrow was going to happen, but not yet and not here. Marsh was sleeping. His mother was still in the chair, also sleeping now, her head tilted at the uncomfortable angle of someone who had fallen asleep in a place not designed for it and hadn't wanted to leave long enough to find somewhere better. Diane looked at this for a moment, then quietly adjusted the blanket that had slipped from the chair arm without waking either of them. She went back to the nurse's station. Suresh called in 18 minutes. The second name, Suresh said, is a procurement liaison named Dale Orvis. He's the person identified as the internal source feeding positional information to Bridger Nautilus. I don't know that name, Diane said. No, Suresh said, but you know the office he works in. He's attached to the Defense Procurement Division that reviewed and shelved the original Bridger Nautilus contracting inquiry 4 years ago. She understood. The inquiry that mentioned my unit. The inquiry that almost mentioned your unit, Suresh said. It was shelved before the unit's adjacent operations were formally documented. Orvis was on the review panel. She held the phone and thought about this. 4 years ago, a contracting inquiry that could have exposed Bridger Nautilus had been reviewed and shelved by a panel that included the same person who would later feed her unit's positional information to the same company. It was not coincidence, and it was not complicated. It was a long-running relationship between a contractor and an inside access point, the kind of arrangement that lasted years precisely because it was useful to both parties and because both parties understood that exposure meant consequences that neither wanted. So Orvis isn't new, she said. No, Suresh said. The committee's working theory is that he's been in this relationship for at least 4 years, possibly longer. And the message I received, someone knew the second name before it was sent to me, which means, Suresh said slowly, whoever's been running the parallel documentation effort has had Orvis's name for a while. They weren't warning you about a new development. They were telling you that the investigation you're now part of is going to reach someone who had a prior relationship with your operational history. Diane looked at the window at the end of the hall. Who sent the message, Suresh? A longer pause this time. I think it was Priya, Suresh said. I think she's been the parallel documentation effort. I think she found Orvis's name in the archived contracting review records. She would have had the access, and it's consistent with the kind of forensic trail she would have followed. And I think she sent you the message because she wanted you to know before the committee called you to testify. Why not just tell me directly? Because directly would require her to identify herself as the source, Suresh said. And if she's been running an unauthorized parallel documentation effort inside a structure that's already under investigation for compromise, identifying herself prematurely would complicate her position, Diane said. Yes. Diane understood this. She also understood that Suresh saying I think rather than I know was its own form of communication, a careful distance that Suresh was maintaining for reasons she didn't need spelled out. All right, she said. Thank you. Diane, Suresh's voice shifted slightly. The committee chair has formally requested your testimony. The hearing is in 6 days. I'll be there. She spent the next 3 days at the Forward Medical Facility, because 3 days was what the patients in her care required before the handoff to the long-term recovery team was clean enough that she could make it without leaving gaps. She was methodical about this in the way she was methodical about every handoff, thorough, specific, documented, in a way that left the receiving team with no ambiguity about what they were walking into and why every decision she had been made. Marsh was transferred to a surgical recovery facility on day 2. His pupils had equalized. His neurological responses were improving on a trajectory that the surgical team characterized, with appropriate caution, as encouraging. His mother had gone home to Davenport for 2 days to collect things and was coming back, which Marsh had tried to tell her was unnecessary, and which she had declined to hear, and which Diane, from a purely clinical standpoint, thought was probably the right call. When Marsh was being moved, he asked one of the transport nurses to pass something to Diane, because Diane was 3 rooms away completing a medication reconciliation and hadn't come to say goodbye, which was not because she didn't intend to, but because she had been in the middle of something and the timing had narrowed. The transport nurse brought her a folded piece of paper. On it, in handwriting that was slightly unsteady, which was consistent with someone 3 days post-cranial surgery, Marsh had written, "I'm going to be okay. Thank you for making that decision." She held the paper for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went back to the medication reconciliation, because the handoff was not done and Marsh being okay was the intended outcome. Not a surprise. And the job was still the job. She visited Farrow on the morning of the 3rd day. He was awake and alert and had the slightly flattened affect of someone 4 days post-operative who was still managing pain but not currently overwhelmed by it. The room was small and functional. A window. A chair. A monitor tracking the vital signs of a man who had spent 19 days in a deteriorating position and was now healing from surgery on a structure that had been bleeding slowly for 4 of those days. She sat in the chair. She didn't start with the anger, because starting with anger in a hospital room with someone who was 4 days post-op was not something she was willing to do regardless of how warranted the anger was. She started with, "How's the pain management?" "Adequate," he said, which meant it was not adequate, but he was tolerating it. "Tell the team if it's not adequate," she said. "There's no benefit to undertreating post-surgical pain." "I know." "Then act like it." A short silence. "You're angry," he said. "I was angry," she said. "I've had 3 days to work through it." "And?" She looked at him. He was 58 years old with gray at his temples and a face that had accumulated the specific kind of weight that came from a career spent making decisions that other people's lives depended on. He did not look like a man who had done something cynical. He looked like a man who had done something he believed was necessary and was fully aware that believing something was necessary did not make it right. "You should have told me about the complaint," she said, "before you brought me in." "Yes," he said, "I should have." "I would have made the same decision," she said. "I think, but it was mine to make with full information." "I know that." "You calculated that I wouldn't go in if I knew the full stakes," she said. "You were probably right in the short term. But you were wrong about what I would have done with more time and more information." He looked at her. "What would you have done?" "The same thing," she said. "Eventually. But on my own terms, and without spending the first 20 minutes of a live operation recalibrating my threat assessment based on things I found out too late." He absorbed this. He had the grace not to argue with it. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at the window. "I know," she said. "Take the pain management seriously. The spleen repair is solid, but you're going to set yourself back if you try to under-medicate through the recovery." She stood. "Diane," he said. She stopped. "The committee is going to ask you to stay involved," he said. "Beyond the 6 days. The investigation has scope that's going to take months." "I know." "What are you going to do?" She looked at him for a moment. "Get through the testimony first," she said. "Then decide." She left the room. The committee hearing was held in a federal building in a city she was not going to specify, in a conference room on the 11th floor with a long table and too many chairs and a view of a street below where ordinary city life was proceeding in complete ignorance of what was happening 11 floors up. She testified for 2 hours and 20 minutes. She was not nervous. She had testified before, in different contexts, under different classification levels. And the structure of it was familiar, the careful questions, the careful answers, the places where she said, "I don't know," because she didn't know, which were as important as the places where she said, "I know," because she did. She was precise, and she was complete, and she did not editorialize beyond what the questions required. The committee chair was a woman in her 60s named Hargrove, with reading glasses she took off and put back on at intervals that suggested a habit she'd never bothered to break, and an attention that was sharper than her deliberate pace implied. At the 1-hour mark, Hargrove asked her directly about the abort transmission. "When you received the abort message," Hargrove said, "you had, at that point, information suggesting your coordination node had been compromised, an anonymous warning of unknown origin, and a message in a decommissioned code format. You chose to proceed. Walk me through that decision." Diane walked her through it, the logic, the gaps in the logic, the information she had, and the information she didn't have, the 6 seconds in which she had made a judgment call with an incomplete picture and then acted on it completely. When she finished, Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "You proceeded on a probability," Hargrove said, "not a certainty." "Yes," Diane said. "That's what field decisions are. People who wait for certainty in the field usually wait too long." Hargrove looked at her over the reading glasses. "And if you'd been wrong?" "Then I would have been wrong," Diane said. "And I would have had to live with that. But I wasn't wrong. I had 11 patients. I brought them out. That's what the decision was for." Hargrove put the reading glasses down on the table and looked at her without them. "The clinical interventions you made during the extraction," Hargrove said, "the off-label combination for the personnel with the clotting disorder, the field triage sequencing, the neurological monitoring during transit, the receiving surgical team at the facility submitted a formal evaluation." She paused. "They described your work as, and I'm reading from their report, among the most competent field medical management they had encountered in a non-surgical emergency context." Diane said nothing. "I'm not asking you to respond to that," Hargrove said. "I'm entering it into the record, because the record should be complete." The record should be complete. She thought about 17 documented interventions in an emergency department in Denton, Oregon. She thought about a personnel file that had been deliberately built to cover the necessary ground and nothing more. She thought about a medical director who had placed a note in that file about professional communication and who was currently sitting across a table from a regional auditor who had a different view of the same 18 months. "There's one more thing," Hargrove said. She picked up a document. "The investigation has established that the decision to task the forward unit with the operation that resulted in their 19-day position was influenced by Orvis's access to the scheduling chain. We are also establishing that the original contracting inquiry 4 years ago was shelved partly due to Orvis's intervention on the review panel. She looked at Diane. Which means that an operation your previous unit was adjacent to 4 years ago was protected from scrutiny by the same person who later fed information about the current unit's position. I understand, Diane said. Your unit 4 years ago was never compromised, Hargrove said. The shelved inquiry was not about your unit, but you and your personnel operated for 14 months in a theater where the contractor whose interests were being protected had visibility into adjacent operations. I know, Diane said. We knew something was off. We never had the specific mechanism. You have it now, Hargrove said. She did. 4 years of something unnamed, something that had lived at the edge of operational decisions as a vague wrongness they had learned to work around without understanding. It had a name now, a mechanism, a paper trail that went back further than anyone had initially traced. The thing they had felt but couldn't prove had been real. It had always been real. Yes, she said. I have it now, Shab. The consequences came in stages because consequences of this scale always came in stages, and anyone who expected otherwise hadn't been paying attention to how institutions actually moved. Dale Orvis was placed on administrative suspension within 72 hours of the committee's preliminary findings being transmitted to the relevant oversight office. The suspension was followed, within 2 weeks, by a formal referral to the Department of Justice. His cooperation, like Spate's, was offered through attorneys and accepted with the specific resigned choreography of people who had calculated that the alternative was worse. Gerald Speight resigned as Bridger Nautilus's chief operating officer on the same day the company's board received the committee's formal notification of findings. The resignation statement was 4 sentences long and contained no admission of wrongdoing, which was standard, and which everyone understood to be legally tactical rather than factually accurate. The company itself faced a separate proceeding through the Contracting Oversight Authority, the outcome of which would take months to fully determine. The specific contracts under investigation were suspended during the proceeding. This had consequences for the company's quarterly position that were discussed in business publications with the careful language of financial reporting rather than the direct language of what had actually happened. Priya Suresh was identified, eventually, as the author of the parallel documentation effort. The committee's formal response to this identification was not punitive. It was in a carefully worded letter from Hargrove's office, characterizing her effort as having contributed materially to the completeness of the committee's investigative record. The carefully worded letter stopped short of the word commendation, which Suresh seemed to find either amusing or appropriate depending on which hour of the day you asked her. Diane thought it was appropriate. The people from the forward position recovered at different rates and in different ways, which was how recovery went. Strand required 60 days of specialized monitoring and management before her clotting disorder was back to a stable baseline. The leg injury from the 19-day field dressing resolved without surgical intervention, which the orthopedic team described as somewhat better than expected given the infection's progression at the time of extraction. Marsh was discharged from the surgical recovery facility at the 6-week mark with a rehabilitation plan and a follow-up schedule, and his mother standing in the parking lot with the car running, which was, he later told someone, the most normal thing he had seen in 2 months, and therefore the best. Farah was 6 weeks recovering from the spleen repair. He went back to work on a modified schedule that he probably violated within the first week, which Diane heard about secondhand and was not surprised by. She testified twice more before the committee. The second and third testimonies were shorter, specific questions about specific operational details that the committee's investigators needed to close out particular segments of the record. She answered what she knew, declined to speculate on what she didn't, and was in and out of the federal building both times in under an hour. Between the first and second testimony, she drove back to Denton, Oregon. She had not been back since the night she had left through the back exit of her apartment building with a bag and a memorized license plate number. The drive took the same amount of time it always took, and the fog was doing what the fog did in this valley in the morning, and the highway into town was the same highway. She parked in the hospital parking lot. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she went in. Pauline was at the nurse's station. Pauline saw her before she was halfway across the department and got up from the station with an expression that started as surprise and went somewhere more complex than that. I heard you were on leave, Pauline said. I was. Are you back? Not yet, Diane said. I have things to sort out. Pauline looked at her for a long moment, taking inventory, the way people who cared about someone did after an absence that had been unexplained and longer than expected. You look tired, Pauline said. I am tired, Diane said. I'm okay. Those are different things. I know. Pauline nodded. She did not press, which was what Diane had always valued about her. Harold Prentice was discharged last week, she said. He asked about you before he left. I told him you were on leave. How was he? Good. His daughter was there. A pause. He left something for you. She went to the break room. On the small shelf above the coffee maker, the reliably terrible coffee maker that she had coexisted with for 3 years without ever trying to improve it, there was an envelope with her name on it in the careful handwriting of someone who had taken their time. Inside was a card. On the front was a mountain landscape. Inside, Harold Prentice had written, I heard you saw something the others missed. I don't know what you saw or how you knew to look. I only know I'm here to write this note. That's enough for me. Thank you. She stood in the break room for a moment with the card in her hand. Then she poured herself a cup of the terrible coffee and drank it standing up, which was how she had drunk it for 3 years, and which felt, in some ways she couldn't precisely articulate, like a kind of homecoming. She requested a meeting with Dr. Raymond Greer. His assistant scheduled it for the same afternoon. When she walked into his office, Greer was already standing, not behind his desk, but beside it, which was a departure from the positioning he had always used before. The positioning of someone using furniture as architecture of authority. The framed photograph of him with the health commissioner was still on the wall. The plant was still slowly dying. He looked, she thought, like a man who had recently learned something about himself that he was still in the process of organizing. Diane, he said, thank you for coming in. Of course, she said. He gestured to the chair. She sat. He sat, not behind the desk, but in the second chair, across from her rather than above her, which was deliberate, and which she noted without making it significant. The auditor's report, he said. Yes. The management review recommendation. He paused. I want you to know, I've been informed that the recommendation is going to result in a formal restructuring of reporting relationships in the department. I know, she said. Your name is cited 17 times in the clinical excellence documentation, he said. I should have been the one documenting those interventions, not because they needed my endorsement to be valid, because I was responsible for this department and I wasn't looking at what was in front of me. She looked at him. He was not a bad doctor. He had never been a bad doctor. His clinical skills were competent and his knowledge was solid. He was a man who had organized the world in a way that served him and had stopped questioning the organization because nobody had ever required him to. Dr. Greer, she said, the restructuring is about the department. The patients in this department deserve a structure where clinical concerns are heard on their merits. That's what the recommendation is for. I know, he said. It's not about me specifically. No, he said. But you specifically were the person I failed to hear, and I'm aware of that. She looked at him for a moment. He was uncomfortable. He was not performing contrition. He was sitting with something genuinely difficult and not trying to talk his way out of it, which was more than she had expected when she drove into this parking lot. The note in my file, she said, about professional communication. He was quiet for a moment. I've removed it, he said, as of this morning. She nodded once. Are you coming back? He asked. She looked at the dying plant on his windowsill. It had lost 2 more leaves since she'd last been in this room. Give it some water, she said, and move it closer to the window. He looked at the plant, then back at her. That's not an answer. No, she said. It's not. Not yet. She left his office. She walked through the department one more time, not as someone returning to work, but as someone looking at a place they had spent 3 years and trying to understand what those 3 years had been. The torn armrests on the waiting room chairs, the Bay 4 light that still flickered on the same cycle, the supply cart in Bay 3 that somebody had restocked in the wrong order again. She could see that from here. She stopped at the Bay 3 cart. She reorganized it. It took 4 minutes. Nobody asked her what she was doing, and she didn't explain. Then she walked out. She accepted the committee consultation on a defined 6-month contract. The work was not field work. It was the kind of work that happened in rooms with documents and people who asked careful questions and needed someone who had been in the places the documents described and could tell them what the documents weren't capturing. She was good at this, in the same way she was good at any task that required paying close attention to what was actually present, rather than what was supposed to be present. She was also, in the 3rd month of the contract, asked to contribute to a review of medical support protocols for forward-deployed units, a working group that included people from several disciplines, and that was trying to build something better out of the lessons of what had gone wrong. She contributed to this with the specificity of someone who had spent years in those positions and 3 more years in an emergency department and understood, from both sides of the wall, where the protocols broke down and where they held. The working group's report was submitted at the end of the contract period. It was classified, so its specific contents would never be public. But the protocols it recommended were adopted, and the adoption meant that somewhere in the future, in situations she would never know about, people would have slightly better tools and slightly better procedures, and some of them would come home who might not have otherwise. She did not know if this was enough. She was not sure enough was a thing you arrived at in this kind of work. You did what you could with what you had in the time you had, and then you did it again, and the accumulation of that was not satisfaction exactly. It was something more durable than satisfaction, something that didn't depend on being recognized or validated or placed correctly in any hierarchy. She had learned this not from training but from years of doing it, and she carried it the way she carried most things she had learned the hard way. Without display, without drama, in the specific quiet that came from having worked something through all the way to the bottom. The 6-month contract ended on a Tuesday in early spring. She drove back to Denton. She had been back several times during the contract for committee-related matters, staying at a motel off the main road because her apartment lease had technically lapsed during the leave, though the building manager, a practical woman named Dora, who had been managing that building for 14 years and had seen enough of life to know when not to be rigid about paperwork, had kept the apartment more or less intact on a verbal understanding that Diane would sort it out when she sorted it out. She sorted it out. The apartment smelled slightly stale, and the faucet in the bathroom was still leaking, but the bookshelf was still organized, and the mountain photograph was still on the wall, and the space was hers, in the quiet way that places become yours. Not because of what you put into them, but because of the accumulation of days you spent inside them. She fixed the faucet herself. She had a small set of tools she kept for exactly this kind of thing, and the repair took 20 minutes and 1 trip to the hardware store 2 blocks away. The hardware store had not changed. The leaking sound was gone by evening. She went back to Callaway Regional on a Wednesday morning. The restructuring had happened in her absence. Greer was still the medical director, but his role had been restructured. A deputy director position had been created to handle clinical oversight separately from administrative management, and the person in that role was Sandra Tully, who had accepted it with the combination of genuine commitment and realistic expectation that characterized her approach to most things. Sandra was at the nurses' station when Diane came in. She looked at Diane for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read and then settled into something direct and warm. "Bay assignments are on this board," Sandra said. "I know where the board is," Diane said. "I know you know." A pause. "It's good to see you." Diane looked at the board. She looked at the department, the waiting room with its torn armrests, the flickering light above Bay 4, the specific organized chaos of an emergency department in a mid-morning surge. "Bay 4 light still needs fixing," she said. "It's been on the maintenance request list for 3 months," Sandra said. "I'll follow up," Diane said. She picked up the first chart. The shift started the way shifts started, without announcement, without ceremony, with the immediate specific demands of people who needed something and had come to this place because they had nowhere else to go. She moved through it the way she had always moved through it, completely, without abbreviation, with the full weight of attention that every person in that department had always received from her, whether or not anyone was watching, whether or not anyone would remember, whether or not the chart would ever reflect who had actually been standing at the bedside when the decision mattered. Pauline stopped her at the nurses' station around 11. "There's a man in Bay 2, Pauline said quietly. "Former military. He asked if you were on shift." She went to Bay 2. The man was in his late 50s, gray-haired, sitting on the bed, with the upright posture of someone who had not entirely learned to let a hospital bed do its job. He was not someone she knew. He looked at her when she came in with the recognition of someone who had been told what to look for. "You're Ashford," he said. "Yes." "My son was one of the 11, he said. "Devon Marsh." She looked at him. "He told me what happened," the man said. "What you did in the field, what you've been doing since." He stopped. He had the face of a man who had prepared what he wanted to say and was now finding that the preparation hadn't been entirely adequate for the actual moment. "I don't know the right words for this," he said. I wanted to see where you worked. I wanted to, I don't know, tell you something." "How's he doing?" she asked. "Good," the man said. "Really good. He's back in PT. He's back." His voice changed on the last word, going briefly to something he didn't try to cover. "He's back." She stood at the bedside. "I'm glad," she said. And she meant it in the specific way she had learned to mean it, not as a professional courtesy, not as a bedside manner construct, but as the actual feeling of someone for whom the return of a person from a hard place was never routine, never something that accumulated into numbness, always still the thing it was, a person, continuing. "He said you made a decision," the man said, "in the field, that you could have stopped and you didn't." "I made a judgment call," she said. "That's what he said too." He looked at her. "He also said you didn't make a big deal of it, that you just did it and then kept working." She didn't say anything. He stopped again. "That's something," he said. "That's a kind of person I don't have words for." She thought about Harold Prentice's card on the shelf in the break room. She thought about the 4 minutes it took to reorganize the supply card in Bay 3. She thought about Marcia's handwriting on a piece of paper folded in her pocket, slightly unsteady. "I'm going to be okay." She thought about 11 people. She thought about the ones who came before them, in different places, in different years, in theaters of operation that had no names in any public record. She thought about the work, not the classified work, not the committee work, all of it, everything, the years and the shifts and the decisions made in 6 seconds with incomplete information and the decisions made over long, careful hours with full information and the ones in between that didn't fit any category. She thought about Raymond Greer's note in her file about professional communication, which was gone now, removed on a Tuesday morning by a man who had finally looked at what was in front of him. She thought about what it cost to be a person who did things without requiring an audience. She thought about how that cost was real. It was not noble. It was not without weight. There were years of it, and the years were not always fine. There were nights in that small apartment when the faucet leaked and the mountain photograph was the only thing on the wall, and the quiet was heavy enough to press against the chest. But there was also Harold Prentice's daughter calling from the ICU waiting room. There was also Devon Marsh's handwriting. There was also this man in Bay 2 who had come to a hospital in Denton, Oregon, not as a patient but to find a nurse, because his son had told him something about a decision made in the dark, and he needed to put a face to it. These things were not rewards. They were not compensation for the years. They were just true. They were simply what had happened. And the thing about what had happened was that it could not be taken back or minimized or reclassified or placed in a file with a note about professional communication. It existed completely, the way anything existed that had actually occurred, permanent in the way that only real things were permanent, beyond the reach of any hierarchy, any dismissal, any institution that had ever tried to place her in a category smaller than what she was. She had never needed anyone to know her story. She had only ever needed to live it honestly. "Sir," she said, "I need to see my next patient, but I'm glad you came." He nodded. He was not going to cry. He was close to it, in the way that fathers who have almost lost something and then found it intact came close to it, but he held. "Thank you," he said. It was not an elaborate thing. It was the exact right size. She left the bay. She picked up the next chart. She went to work. Outside, the fog that Denton collected every morning was beginning to lift, burning off at the edges the way it always did when the day had warmed enough, the way it had done every morning for the 3 years she had been here and would continue to do long after, indifferent to all of it, attending to its own business with the steady reliability of things that did not require recognition.